The rules are simple. All that is needed is a revolver, some cartridges, and one or more players. The revolver is opened, a single cartridge loaded, and the cylinder spun. The players then take turns placing the revolver against their heads and pulling the trigger. Depending on the rules, the cylinder is either respun after each play or left as is. Play continues until a player either forfeits or blows their brains out. This is Russian Roulette, a deadly game of chance with a dark allure, which through countless portrayals in popular culture has become known as the pastime of the unhinged, of the desperate, or those with nothing left to live for. In reality, however, the majority of the victims of Russian roulette have been ordinary people whose attempts to recreate what they have seen in films or television ultimately ended in tragedy. But where did the idea of Russian roulette come from in the first place, and how many people have actually played this most dangerous of games? The first written description of something resembling Russian roulette comes from The Fatalist, the final chapter of Russian author Mikhail Lermontov's 1840 novel A Hero of Our Time. In the chapter, the protagonist of the novel, Pechorin, tells the story of Lieutenant Valech, a Cossack officer who becomes embroiled in a debate about fate and destiny. Believing that a man's death is predestined and cannot be changed, Valech pulls a random pistol off of the wall, primes the pan, and places it against his head and pulls the trigger. When the gun fails to go off, his comrades conclude that it must have been unloaded. But when Valech reprimes the weapon and aims it at the wall, this time it goes off. Mere hours later, Valech's fatalism is vindicated when he is cut down by a drunken, saber-wielding soldier chasing after an escaped pig. The more familiar form of Russian roulette would have to await the development of the modern cartridge-firing revolver. The most common origin given for Russian roulette is among Tsarist forces in 1917, when, according to one account, their officers felt that they were not only losing prestige, money, family, and country, but were being also dishonored before their colleagues of the Allied armies. Some officer would suddenly pull out his revolver anywhere, at the table, in a cafe, at a gathering of friends, remove a cartridge from the cylinder, spin the cylinder, snap it back in place, put it to his head, and pull the trigger. However, there are a number of problems with this account. First, the service revolver in use with the Russian army during this period, the M1895 Nagant, is unique in having a mechanism that cams the cylinder forward with every shot, creating a tight gas seal between the cylinder and the barrel. This mechanism makes it functionally impossible to spin the cylinder freely, as is required when playing Russian roulette. But the main issue is that the preceding passage comes not from a historical account, but rather a 1937 short story written by Swiss-American adventure writer George Serres. First published in Collier's magazine in January 1937, the story, titled Russian Roulette, takes the form of a letter written by Sergeant Hugo Feldheim of the French Foreign Legion to his lieutenants seeking advice on how to cover up the suicide of fellow officer Sergeant Bukowski. Bukowski, a gambling addict, introduces Feldheim to the titular game, which he picked up while serving in the Russian army during the First World War. Seeking ever greater thrills, Bukowski plays the game with increasing frequency, ultimately resulting in his death. The story was the first popular depiction of Russian roulette, and the first to refer to it by that name. However, as Serres kept few research notes, it is unknown whether this depiction is based on actual accounts or whether he simply made the whole thing up. Evidence pointing to the latter includes the aforementioned incompatibility of the Russian Nagant revolver and the fact that in Serres' description of the game, 5 cartridges are loaded instead of only 1, giving 1 in 6 odds of survival that one imagines none but the most foolhardy of players would be willing to accept. Nonetheless, there is historical evidence of Russian recruits introducing some form of firearms-based game of chance to the French Foreign Legion in the 1920s. In his 1991 History of the Legion, author Douglas Porch writes, "The Russian recruits may have been poor soldiers, but they were credited with one cultural innovation in the post-war Legion, the game of Coucou. Apparently imported from Tsarist army messes, Couch was a variation upon Russian roulette, with the odds of survival greatly reduced. The rules required one legionnaire chosen by lot to step outside while his comrades arranged themselves around the walls of a completely darkened room. The signal legionnaire then entered the room and said cacao, while one imagined simultaneously taking violent evasive action, as his comrades took this as a cue to fire their revolvers in his general direction." But whatever the veracity of Serres' story, its impact on the American popular psyche was immediate and long-lasting. On January 8, 1938, less than a year after its publication, Thomas H. Markley Jr. of Austin, Texas, killed himself while playing Russian roulette to celebrate his 21st birthday. birthday. It was to be the first in a long line of similar incidents that would claim dozens of lives over the following decades, including those of R&B musician Johnny Ace in 1954 and actor John Eric Hexum in 1984. The most public and shocking of these deaths occurred on September 3, 1976, during a performance of Finnish magician Aimo Leikis's famous Russian roulette act. The act involved loading a revolver from a mixed box of live and dummy ammunition, with Leikis supposedly using psycho powers to select only the dummy rounds. Leikis had performed the act without incident for over a year, but on that fateful day, he accidentally selected a live round and fatally shot himself in front of a live audience. But perhaps the most influential cultural depiction of Russian roulette comes from the 1978 Vietnam War film The Deer Hunter. In the film's most infamous scene, 3 American soldiers, played by Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and John Savage, are captured by the Vietnamese and forced to play Russian roulette for their guards' entertainment. Walken's character, Corporal Nick Chevatarovich, turns to playing Russian roulette for money, ultimately leading to his death. In addition to shocking audiences, the film generated significant controversy over its depiction of the Vietnamese treatment of American POWs, with many pointing out that there was no evidence for the events depicted in the infamous scene. In his review of the film, however, Roger Ebert defended the use of Russian roulette as an artistic choice. It is the organizing symbol of the film. Anything you can believe about the fame, about its deliberately random violence, about how it touches the sanity of men forced to play it, will apply to the war as a whole. It is a brilliant symbol because, in the context of this story, it makes an ideological statement about the war superfluous. Tragically, in addition to re-implanting Russian roulette in the popular psyche, the release of The Deer Hunter led to a major resurgence of copycat suicides. According to psychiatrist Thomas Radetzky and columnist Paul Simon, between 1978 and 1989, a total of 35 deaths in the United States were directly attributable to games of Russian roulette inspired by viewings of The Deer Hunter. And the trend continues to the present day, with one of the most recent Russian roulette deaths taking place on January 24, 2019. The incident involved 2 St. Louis police officers, Caitlin Alex and Nathaniel Hedron, playing a variation of the game called Russian Poker, in which the players point the weapon at each other rather than at themselves. During the second round, the weapon discharged, killing Officer Caitlin. Of course, it is impossible to know the exact number of people killed by Russian roulette, as the aftermath of a solo game is often indistinguishable from suicide, and surviving players often cover up the cause of death to protect themselves. Nor is it possible to know who will be seduced by the game's deadly allure.
Just before we get back to today's video, wanted to briefly mention Good Store. Not a sponsor, just a group of humans doing humaning the right way, making great products all of us use some form of pretty much every day, and then donating 100% of their profits, over $11 million to date, to high-impact charities. For those unfamiliar, there are currently 4 main categories of product at Good Store, primarily supporting 3 main causes. First, they have the Awesome Socks and Undies Club, which features new designs from independent artists each month printed on soft and comfy socks and underwear. This, along with their Sunbase and soap, shampoo, and candle products line, goes to help support the Maternal Center of Excellence Hospital in Sierra Leone, a region of the world with one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, something the workers at that hospital, which just opened up this year, are hoping to change presently. Next up, we have their Coffee and Tea Keats & Co. line, which this one goes to fight the disease that has killed more humans than any other infectious disease in history in tuberculosis. If you like tea or coffee, Keats & Co. is incredibly good, and they have a tea lover's gift set if you know someone who also enjoys imbibing hot leaf water. Finally, they have their EcoGeek line of products that has everything from non-toxic, all-purpose cleaners, hand soaps, laundry detergent, and dryer sheets, dishwasher tabs, and even a new dishwasher powder, designed in part with the help of noted dishwasher obsessor Alec from Technology Connections, who has helped many of us, myself included, learn to use our dishwashers the right way. All profits from the EcoGeek product line goes to help support the Coral Reef Alliance. In the end, though there is no better time to be alive than today, because the past was the worst, the world still has problems, lots of them. Good Store is trying to help with a few of those problems as best they can, and you can help too by switching from your normal store-bought everyday products to Good Store's phenomenal, ethically sourced, and environmentally friendly packaged products, where all the profits go to helping make the world a little bit a better place. If this sounds interesting to you, use the link in the description below to check it out and get 10% off at Good Store. Now back to today's video.
Countless films produced in the United States feature the use of rather expensive military equipment and often real-world military personnel. Given the extreme expense of all of this using things paid for by the US taxpayer to benefit for-profit companies, how is that allowed? Further, how are projects that the military will support selected? Can just any US citizen apply for use of such equipment and personnel for their particular project to make it all fair? And just how much does this cost the US taxpayer in cases like, for example, the recent wildly profitable Top Gun Maverick? And why and how did it all get started? As the why, as William Brady, one-time head of the National Association of the Motion Picture Industry, wrote in 1917 to US President Woodrow Wilson, the motion picture can be made the most wonderful system for spreading the national propaganda at little or no cost. Fast forwarding to the mid-20th century, and the United States Office of War Information even had a Bureau of Motion Pictures which reviewed over 1,600 film scripts in the United States during World War II. As to why, well, once again, as the Bureau's head, Elmer Davis, stated, the easiest way to inject a propaganda idea into most people's minds is to let it go through the medium of an entertainment picture when they do not realize they're being propagandized. Beyond propaganda, the second commonly stated reason as to why this is a benefit to the military is in recruitment. That said, it may surprise you to learn that despite what almost every media outlet says, even the original Top Gun actually didn't have much of any measurable effect on recruitment numbers when you actually look at the data, as we'll get into in a bit. This now brings us to how it all got started. While going all the way back to 1910, there were examples of films that featured military equipment being used. It was in the lull between World War I and World War II that the relationship between Hollywood and the military became fixed with the 1927 flick Wings. With a cast that included about 3,000 infantry and a bunch of US military planes and pilots, Wings not only won the Best Picture Oscar, but it showed how cooperation between the military and Hollywood provided huge benefits to both. Hollywood created an authentic military experience at a discount rate and enjoyed commercial and critical success. And the military had what was for them essentially a great recruitment film displayed in theaters across the country. They also had an invaluable tool for changing public perception of a given war and the potential righteousness of it, as well as being able to influence perception of what it was like to be a soldier and the idealized version of that person in life. As such, during and after World War II, Hollywood war movies nearly universally featured brave men whose causes were just and successful, even if they perished, with notable titles like 1945's They Were Expendable, the 1949's Sands of Iwo Jima, the 1951 The Flag Leathernecks, 1953's Stalag 17, The Bridges at Toko Ri in 1954, The Longest Day in 1962, and The Great Escape in 1963. Likewise, films like From Here to Eternity, Mr. Roberts, South Pacific, and Operation Petticoat put a positive human face on the war and its servicemen. And it is precisely this that led author Lawrence Sood to coin the phrase mutual exploitation. According to Sood, when I was getting my film degree, it suddenly occurred to me that people in the US had never seen the US lose a war in film, and when President Johnson said we can go into Vietnam and win, they believed him because they'd seen 50 years of war movies that were positive. Speaking of Vietnam, things changed dramatically in the negative direction in the aftermath in terms of public perception of the US military and government for pretty obvious reasons. Naturally, the Department of Defense was keen on rehabilitating that image and turned to their friends in Hollywood for help, with it generally noted that the phenomenal film Top Gun was the most successful of all of this, though not without some controversy in the aftermath. Tom Cruise himself rang in on this in an interview in 1990, stating, "Some people felt that Top Gun was a right-wing film to promote the Navy, and a lot of kids loved it. But I want the kids to know that that's not the way war is, that Top Gun was just an amusement park ride, a fun film with a PG-13 rating that was not supposed to be reality. That's why I didn't go on and make Top Gun 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. That would have been irresponsible." And well, now that is awkward. In any event, so important was this relationship between the Department of Defense and film studios that since the middle of the century, the Pentagon has had a permanent liaison to deal with studios, with such individuals over time, including Donald Baruch, Philip Strube, David Evans, as well as countless others from specific branches of the military to further consult. A big part of these individuals' job is reviewing scripts to see if they meet potential selection criteria. As to how they decide what to accept, former Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Alan Ortiz rings in, "There really is no hard equation when it comes to determining if the Department of Defense is going to support a particular project, but there are some core requirements that the production has to meet. The biggest things we look for are verifiable proof of funding and distribution. We're looking for reasonable authenticity in any production that we're supporting when it comes to scripted productions. Obviously, with unscripted projects, that's different, but we strive to get things as close as we possibly can. We're really looking to tell that story and to articulate, project, and protect the image of the US military and the men and women who serve." Chief of Entertainment at the Department of Defense, Glenn Roberts, further chimes in, "We do not provide support to shows that depict storylines that violate military policy. For example, there's a show on TV that shows uniformed men and women conducting law enforcement activities like kicking doors in and arresting drug dealers. We don't support that particular show because that is against the Posse Comitatus Act, which is that US active duty military service members do not conduct domestic law enforcement. We're really trying to ensure that we stay inside the lines of integrity, but we're perfectly fine with fictional approaches. We work with Marvel movies. There's no Hulk, there's no Thor, Captain Marvel, or Iron Man, but we're still happy to support those movies. We're really looking to ensure the integrity of the institution as a whole." They even go so far as to require any extras portraying military personnel being up to snuff. For example, in one section of the 84-page agreement between the Department of Defense and the makers of the smashingly good Top Gun Maverick, it states, in order to get the Department of Defense support, the production company will cast actors, extras, doubles, and stunt personnel portraying service members who conform to individual military service regulations governing age, height, weight, uniform, grooming, appearance, and conduct standards. So going back to Roberts, he goes on that despite these stringent requirements, the film does not have to be a love letter to the military. It doesn't mean that there can't be a bad person, a villain per se, who is in uniform, as long as it actually upholds the integrity of the men and women in uniform and the ability to do their job. Humor is good. We laugh at ourselves. We're happy to laugh at ourselves. Like I said, it's not unheard of to have a bad guy or bad girl, so to speak, in a villain's role. Going back to the funding requirement, Roberts elaborates, there's a lot of folks that want to come shoot the movie, but they don't have funding or they don't have distribution. We need to make sure that we're good stewards of the taxpayers' money and their resources. We only utilize those resources and make them available for things that are really going to be seen in the public eye. That said, as noted by the aforementioned David Evans, the Department of Defense also makes an effort to work with many student filmmakers. Quote, "The services might want to do something because it's no sweat to them to help a student along." And on this one and many documentaries, quote, "9 times out of 10, what they are seeking for is access to individuals and access to installations just to get supplemental footage. And most of this is just footage of the military doing its normal thing, so it's not incurring any additional costs or effort, just someone wanting to come film it and possibly talk to service members about something they do or have done. That said, the documentaries do usually have to have funding and distribution secured for what they are doing. But in some cases, they may still get a pass if the project looks right and the individuals involved are known and respected. With Phil Strubb chiming in, sometimes we'll ease over to, okay, it looks legit, and yes, you've got a really good reputation within the community, we'll go ahead and support this one. On top of this, as motion picture and television entertainment liaison and army officer Todd Bresciale states, they also look at what their equipment is going to be used for. For example, if the studio, to quote him, just wanted cheap props essentially, that would typically get rejected out of turn. Further, if the equipment they were asking for in a given scene was wildly unrealistic as to the way it might actually be used in real life, in his words, quote, "bringing a knife to a gunfight," he'd also potentially reject at least use of that specific equipment on those grounds. It's also noted that during any filming and review of footage, they are looking to make sure that nothing classified at all is given away anywhere, even unintentionally. Going back to Top Gun Maverick, this is allegedly one factor as to why the F-35 was not used for the mission, along with the fact that it's a single-seat aircraft, so they would have had to CGI the actors into the jets instead of actually being there, as was possible with the FA-18s used in most of the flight sequences. It's also potentially noteworthy that the F-35's estimated cost per hour is almost 3 times that of an FA-18, which may or may not have also played into things, as we'll get into when we discuss the costs of everything later, and the interesting discrepancy from what is publicly stated by the Department of Defense versus the actual cost when you dig a little deeper. In any event, if the script passes the initial screening, it is then handed off to the appropriate liaison officers in respective branches of the military for actual approval or not, and for their own thoughts on the script and any changes they might recommend. This is not just to get the script final approval, but also sometimes just plain helpful ideas from the people in the military whose job it is to do the things depicted in the films. In fact, sometimes the filmmakers themselves will explicitly request thoughts on a given scene or sequence in a film to try and get it as accurate as possible, or see if the military professionals have a better idea than what's currently in the script for how to do something. Pertinent to the topic at hand, the entire plot of Top Gun Maverick was built off of ideas that came directly from the Navy, according to director Joseph Kosinski. He states he asked the Navy reps, "What's the hardest, gnarliest, scariest mission you could ever imagine having to do with a naval aviator?" The reps then began throwing out ideas, which he says he then just built the mission off of pretty much exactly as they suggested. The specific ideas were carrier launch, low-level ingress through a canyon defended by SAMs on a target that's jammed GPS, hit the target with a buddy laser system, and you've got a pull at the end, and another SAM array waiting for you, and enemy aircraft patrolling the skies. Kosinski goes on that the only suggestion he didn't take there for the mission was to make it night, as obviously that wouldn't exactly be very cinematic, though of course would have made it much more difficult for the pilots. We should also point out that during and after filming filming, it would seem, at least based on the Top Gun Maverick agreement between the Department of Defense and the studio, the military generally requires that they get to review any changes to the script as well as to look over the footage before it's shown to the general public. Specifically, the agreement states the production company must obtain in advance Department of Defense concurrence for any subsequent substantial changes proposed to the military depictions made to either the picture or the sound portions of the production before it is exhibited to the public. The production company agrees to involve the DoD project officer in these changes, including those that may be made during post-production. It also states the production company shall provide the DoD and CNAF project officers with a viewing of the roughly edited but final version of the production, the rough cut, at a stage in editing when changes can be accommodated, but only to the extent required to allow the DoD to confirm that the tone of the military sequences substantially conforms to the agreed script treatment or narrative description, to preclude release or disclosure of sensitive security-related or classified information, and to ensure that the privacy of DoD personnel is not violated. Should DoD determine that the material in the production comprises any of the preceding concerns, DoD will alert the production company of the material, and the production company will remove the material from the production. End quote. Speaking of security concerns, going back to the F-35 in the film, the agreement also states that F-35 Joint Program Office will have on-site program manager to conduct security review of all F-35 footage on board. Any footage deemed classified or sensitive will be deleted or turned over to the US Navy prior to debarking the ship. Further controversy comes from that if the military or some war isn't being painted in a light they like, even if extremely accurate to reality and real events, the use of military equipment and personnel will not be approved, or at least not without the studio changing the film in the way the Department of Defense wants. That said, contrary to what is sometimes implied, this isn't necessarily nefarious, often much more mundane. For example, in the original Top Gun, Maverick's ladylove in the movie was supposed to be a fellow soldier, but such a romantic relationship was not allowed in real life, and thus the Department of Defense required that the script be changed to accommodate. Thus, the screenwriters simply rewrote the character of Charlotte Blackwood to be a civilian. Moving on to the 2002 film Wind Talkers, starring Nicolas Cage, about the real-life Navajo code talkers used during World War II, there were a handful of changes the Department of Defense wanted that the filmmakers weren't exactly pleased about, but nonetheless gave in. For starters, there was a scene in which one of the Marines, nicknamed the Dentist, is shown pulling the gold fillings out of a dead Japanese soldier's mouth. When the script was passed off to Captain Matt Morgan of the Marine Corps, Morgan wrote in his feedback to Strub, "This has to go. The activity is unmarine. I recommend these characters be looting the dead for intelligence or military souvenirs. Swords, knives, field glasses. Loot is still not cool, but more realistic and less brutal. Seems reasonable enough." The ultimate feedback then to producer Terrence Chang was, the Dentist character displays distinctly unmarine behavior. He is in fact committing an atrocity. While I recognize the war in the Pacific was brutal, I don't see a need to portray a Marine as a ghoul. There apparently was some back and forth arguing with this, with the writer of the film, Joe Batir, arguing this sort of looting and things of that nature did happen, which Morgan didn't deny. Again, attempting to be reasonable, Morgan further stated, "Listen, if you're gonna do something like this, is this gonna be something that's gonna be dealt with in the movie? Because you don't deal with it. I mean, you just got a guy who shows up and he's doing it like he was washing his car or something. If you're going to portray this, let's deal with it. The why, the how, was it reciprocal? You know, because the Japanese were doing awful things to the Marines too." Ultimately, it was decided just to cut the scene, as was a scene where one of the Marines murders with a flamethrower a Japanese soldier who was trying to surrender. On this one, the screenwriters really wanted to keep the scene, owing to it being critical to show that the character in question was, to quote, damaged at that point by his experiences in the war. However, Bresciali explains, if you're going to show a soldier committing a war crime, then you're going to also need to show how the Uniform Code of Military Justice deals with that and the punishment that they would suffer, or at least ideally suffer. Again, the reality of the war in the Pacific was sometimes quite different from what the Department of Defense was willing to depict here. Perhaps the most controversial change, however, was a scene in which the soldiers are told that if it looks like they're going to be captured, they should kill their code talker rather than allow the enemy to take him captive. While you could see why the Department of Defense wouldn't want that in there, Chang stated, the whole movie was based on that assumption. We did talk to code talkers, and they said that was true. Why would they lie to me? On this point, former code talker John Brown Jr. stated, the Marine order was to let them shoot you if you were captured. That was war. We were obligated. Code talker Carl Gorman also stated the same among several others. Congress even rang in on this when they awarded the Congressional Gold Medals to 29 code talkers, with part of the legislation in the bill stating some code talkers were guarded by fellow Marines whose role was to kill them in case of imminent capture by the enemy. Despite all of this, the Marine Corps still denied this was ever actually a thing and would not allow it to be put in the movie if the filmmakers wanted Department of Defense support for the film. Thus, a compromise was reached where the script was changed from ordering the soldiers to kill their code talker if captured to, under no circumstances can you allow your code talker to fall into enemy hands. Your mission is to protect the code at all costs. Do you understand? More or less implying the same thing without explicitly saying it. Moving on from there, Kevin Costner's 13 Days covering the Cuban Missile Crisis was reportedly denied military aid in the filmmaking because of how they depicted the generals being eager to invade Cuba, something based on well-documented real-world discussions. When the military requested changes to correct this perceived negative portrayal, the studio rejected the suggested changes and thus were denied the use of military equipment and personnel. For some movies, this would stop it from being made, given increased costs without Department of Defense support, but that was not the case for this film. Moving on from there, a rather surprising film that initially was going to get military support, but the Department of Defense ultimately pulled out of, was the 1996 blockbuster Independence Day. As to why, writer Dean Devlin states, their one demand was that we remove Area 51 from the film, and we didn't want to do that, so they withdrew their support. In a slightly more humorous example, according to David Robb's 2004 book, Operation Hollywood, in the James Bond film GoldenEye, the Department of Defense demanded the nationality of Admiral Chuck Farrell be changed from a US admiral to a different nation, owing to perceived incompetence. The studio acquiesced and made him French. The problem was, the studio was also getting help from the French military. GoldenEye screenwriter Bruce Fairstein stated of this, when the French lent us the boat, they wanted to make sure that the French military was in no way made to look bad. When they lend you the toys, they want some say in how the toys are used. Thus, a further switch was made to make the Admiral Canadian. Moving on to Iron Man, Strub states that there originally was a scene in which a military officer was supposed to say they'd kill themselves for the opportunities Iron Man has. Strub recounts, it never got resolved until we were in the middle of filming. Now we're on the flight lines at Edwards Air Force Base and there's 200 people, and the director and I are having an argument about this. He's getting redder and redder in the face and I'm getting just as annoyed. It was pretty awkward. And then he said angrily, well, how about they'd walk over hot coals? I said, fine. He was so surprised it was that easy. Straub elaborates concerning such compromises. I think that's more the way these things go once the filmmakers understand that we're not out to undermine their art, but to try and come up with something that works for them. Oftentimes, it's something they haven't thought of, and they like it, and it makes it better. And that happens all the time. The greater news media never reports it because it's not very sexy to say that things worked out. That said, it doesn't always work out. For example, in another Marvel film, The Avengers, Strub stated, we couldn't reconcile the unreality of this international organization and our place in it. To whom did S.H.I.E.L.D. answer? Did we work for S.H.I.E.L.D.? We hit that roadblock and decided we couldn't do anything. It's one thing, like in Transformers, where you have this unit of mostly soldiers and one airman and they report to the chairman. It's a fictional military organization, but it's not outside the system as compared to S.H.I.E.L.D. S.H.I.E.L.D. is this all-powerful entity that, nuke New York City. Thus, in the end, this was one of the few Marvel films that didn't get Department of Defense support, and instead the jets depicted in the film were simply computer-generated. And I think we can all agree that that denial was warranted just based on the stupidity of the nuking in the first place. So this all brings us around to cost. So how much does this actually cost the US taxpayer? Well, in theory, nothing, though there is a bit of controversy here in terms of some questionable accounting, as we'll get into in a bit. But in general, as the aforementioned Todd Brasale notes, every time you see a piece of military hardware that is not created through CGI, that cost is borne out by the production company unless a specific training mission was pre-scheduled and planned to be flown anyway. The production company would pay the hourly rate for that aircraft. As for the soldiers are paid anyway. For instance, we shot a picture up in Canada and we brought in actual soldiers because they needed to be able to fly the Black Hawk helicopters. So they paid for the soldiers' transportation up there, they paid a rate field cost for the Black Hawks, they paid the hourly rate for the Black Hawks, and then they paid the per diem and hotel expenses for the service members who were on set. However, some have taken issue with all of this even so. In particularly the seemingly generous nature at times things can be lumped into training. For example, Strub states, the thing is, whether it's legitimate training or not isn't necessarily an exact science. For example, on the film set for the made-for-TV movie Vestige of Honor, he notes, I think there were Army National Guard helicopters involved. Watching them take off, land, take off, land, take off, land, I thought this cannot be any meaningful training whatsoever. So I sidled over to their officer in charge and I said, well, I guess you're not getting much training today, are you? And he said, we've gotten more training this morning than a week at Fort Hood. I've got my refuelers here. I've got my emergency medical people here. This brings us to accounting and Top Gun Maverick. Going back to the 84-page agreement between the Department of Defense and the studio, consistent with a normal collaboration between the US military and a film studio, to quote the document, the production company will reimburse the US government for any additional expenses incurred as a result of the assistance rendered for the production of Top Gun Maverick. It's also been reported that the Department of Defense charged the studio $11,374 for each hour of flight time of the FA-18s used in the film that couldn't be chalked up to training. So how much does an hour of flight time actually cost for the FA-18? According to the Department of Defense, exactly that amount, funnily enough. So, no problem there, right? Well, it would seem that that's not actually the real cost per hour of flying an FA-18. Not even close, actually, at least according to former FA-18 pilot and present-day advanced data and analytics consultant Brad Odom, as outlined in his completely unrelated 2016 report, Why Sloppy Accounting is Destroying the US Fighter Inventory. In this one, his report has nothing to do with Hollywood and is simply criticizing the Department of Defense's accounting when it comes to stating operating cost rates for military aircraft and how this is negatively impacting decisions made by commanding officers in real-world scenarios. For example, he notes the inaccuracies, quote, incentivized to overutilize aircraft and to use them for relatively low-quality missions where a cheaper alternative might serve better. Embedded in the piece is a breakdown of the costs of various aircraft, including the FA-18. In particular, the Department of Defense's quoted hourly operating cost of around $11,000 does indeed include everything related to maintaining and flying the aircraft, except one critical and rather expensive thing, the initial cost of the jet itself, which is about $65 million per FA-18. So why is this important when discussing cost per hour? Because each jet has a finite number of hours in its service life, about 6,000 hours. Thus, when you factor in the expected number of hours that each jet will be flown before it's scrapped or becomes a museum piece, that's an additional approximately $10,833 added to the cost of each hour of operation, thus about doubling the cost to just over $22,000 per hour for the FA-18. Going back to Hollywood films, in terms of reimbursement rates for Top Gun Maverick non-training hours, that would mean the studio is only paying about half the real cost per hour for the FA-18. And just as a brief aside for how silly these numbers can get and why it's so important for commanders to be aware of the real numbers when optimally utilizing resources for a given mission, Odom notes that the F-22 Raptor, which the Department of Defense listed at $33,538 per hour when factoring in unit cost, is closer to about $60,000 per hour, and the F-35 is closer to about $50,000 per hour. So going back to Top Gun Maverick, it's reported that they filmed 813 hours of aerial footage in the FA-18s for the film. Now, it's not clear from the quotes from Kaczynski whether that's 813 total flight hours, which would seem extremely excessive, or more likely that they shot 813 hours of total flight footage from all cameras used during the flights. As for how many cameras were used, if you're curious, Kaczynski states there were 6 cameras inside the cockpit, 4 looking at the actor at different angles, and 2 cameras looking forward. He also states that there were cameras mounted on the exterior of the jet and more cameras filming from the ground, but he does not specify exact numbers on this other than to state that at their peak they had 26 total cameras rolling between 2 jets flying and ground cameras. And further than that, when you have 2 fast-moving objects, when you have moments when the footage is good, you're going to get 1 or 2 second pieces worthy of being in the film. In a 14-hour day, 30 seconds was great. Another vital piece of information for tallying things up that we don't have here is how many of these flight hours were counted as training or not. This could be anything from the pilot's need to train in some specific environment or maneuver to just simply getting needed hours in towards their general flight requirement time. But whatever these totals are, to sum the costs up, it would seem that in the general case, the studio had to pay a set rate for the equipment and personnel they used outside of things that could be chalked up to training in order to, in theory, not cost the US taxpayer anything they wouldn't have already had to pay for, except as noted, the hourly rate charged for non-training FA-18 hours, it would seem about half of that of the real cost of $22,000 when adding in the cost of the initial purchase of the jet itself. Thus, on the surface, it seems to cost the US taxpayer quite a lot, actually, even if not discussing potentially how generous or not the Department of Defense was being with what it qualified as training. All of this said, however, there are other factors that might still see this as a steal of a deal for the Department of Defense's general budget and for the taxpayer. And that comes down to recruiting and the rather astronomical amount that the Department of Defense spends just to recruit a single person to some branch of the military, not even talking bonuses and things of that nature to the person, just the cost of staff and expenses to do the recruiting in the first place. On that one, for reference, as tallied up by Rate the Military, an organization set on helping to improve military recruitment efforts, the various branches of the US military combined to spend an average of $18,000 per recruit. These costs come from things like advertising and maintaining about 15,000 staff members, among other operational additional costs of their recruitment efforts. And for reference here, the US military, including all branches, generally tries to recruit roughly 200,000 people to fill their ranks per year. Thus, while allowing their personnel and equipment to be used in films that paint the military in a positive light and encourage recruitment may not come out of the normal recruitment budgets, it is generally seen as doing just this, and even if being super generous about what counts as training and giving studios a bargain deal on the use of equipment outside of that, it still comes at a drastically cheaper rate compared to normal advertising and recruitment methods that the Department of Defense otherwise uses, thus all potentially actually saving the US taxpayer money, even if it's accurate to say that they aren't, for example, being correctly compensated for the use of all those FA-18 flight hours in a film like Top Gun Maverick. For example, going back to the cost per hour of the FA-18, when factoring in the cost of the jet itself, even if we wanted to be wildly inaccurate and say all 813 hours of aerial footage were literally 813 hours of flying and not hours compiled from multiple cameras in the same flights, and even if on top of that we said the Department of Defense chalked up every single one of those hours to training and really shouldn't have, and using the correct $22,000 per hour figure factoring in the cost of the jet, that wildly overinflated figure is still just shy of only $18 million spent. This is a lot of taxpayer money, certainly, but at average cost per recruit numbers, that would mean Top Gun Maverick would only need to recruit an additional 1,000 or so people from its debut to forever to recoup that cost, with anything after that actually saving the taxpayer money. And given inflation rates and things like that, it looks even better. As some kid watching the movie in 10 years might decide to join up, well, that's much cheaper than it would be at the future rate. And the movie is out there, and it will be watched for decades to come. Again, an absolute steal of a deal for the Department of Defense. And given the Department of Defense notes that they have been struggling mightily in recent years to get the number of recruits they need and thus having to continually increase advertising budgets and the like, this is potentially huge. As Major General Ed Thomas of the Air Force Recruitment Service notes, it's a math problem. The national labor shortage is driving millions of unfilled jobs. The nation is bigger. The military is smaller. Few people today know someone who has served. Eligibility to serve has dropped to just 23% due to obesity, medical or other issues, and less people are generally knowledgeable enough about the military to know what a great way of life serving in the military can be. Of course, this is only a steal of a deal if it actually causes people to sign up for the military. So, the big question is, does it? In most cases, that simply isn't measurable in any definitive way, despite studies attempting to do so, such as Linsky-Vazarevsky's 2022 economics thesis, a study of the impact of US Department of Defense and movie industry cooperation on military application rates. That said, in a case like Top Gun, this is often cited to be a rare example where the spike in recruitment after, especially for the US Navy and Air Force, was so high that it's just blatantly obvious. Except, as we alluded to at the beginning of this piece, while you'll often read the Navy saw a 500% increase in recruits the year Top Gun came out, this isn't accurate at all, nor in the years after, and the actual increase appears to have only been about 8%, which, to be fair, given how much the Department of Defense spends on recruitment, seems to be like a massive spike, and it made Top Gun well worth their time, even on year one. Except, here's the thing. While recruitment did go up by 8% as noted, what also went up was the Department of Defense's spending on recruitment. In 1984, for example, it had a $13.1 million advertising budget, which then jumped to $19.9 million in 1985, and in 1986, when Top Gun came out in May of that year, it was at $31 million, more than double 2 years before, and up 36% from the previous year, which again saw an 8% increase. We should also probably point out here that the significant rise in recruitment trend had actually started in 1984, and 1986 and beyond for a bit was just a continuation of that trend. Not just that, as reported in a 1986 edition of the New York Times covering US military recruitment, they also point out that the Navy had not just massively increased advertising year over year leading up to Top Gun, but also that year almost tripled the number of recruiters they had across the United States. They also began implementing a new plan offering $18,800 for college for anyone who served 2 years plus another 4 in the reserves. Again, all for an 8% boost. Further, for whatever it's worth, as Air Force Recruiting Services spokesman Leslie Brown states, at least on their end, on any sort of spike from the original Top Gun, we can't find in the Air Force where that's true. That said, it is pointed out that a positive perception of the military and soldiers is always going to help recruiting, whether this is measurable for a given outlet for that like Top Gun or not, and arguably, the individuals who might have been most inspired by Top Gun to perhaps join the military would be children, with the effect of not coming until potentially many years later and being effectively unmeasurable no matter how much you look at the data. So this brings us back to the original question. So did the original Top Gun actually have any real effect on recruitment, or was it just the increase in spending on recruitment and massive increase in recruiters and added benefits that did it? Or going further, was it something of every business manager's favorite term, synergy between the two? For what it's worth, anecdotal accounts from countless pilots who did sign up note their early interest in doing so came about from watching Top Gun. For example, spokesman for the US Naval Air Forces, Commander Ronald Flanders, states, "If you talk to a lot of the senior pilots in the Navy today, the captains and admirals, many of them attribute their interest in naval aviation today to the original release of that film." Except it does beg the question of whether they perhaps were already invested in flying or the military, or would have become anyway because of their inherent inclinations to such. And thus movies like Top Gun would naturally appeal to them. But even if they had not existed, they probably would have become interested in flying anyway, and may have gone down the same path as the military as one of the best ways to even just become a commercial pilot someday. After all, you'd perhaps have to be not the sharpest tool in the shed if you thought depictions in movies like Top Gun accurately represent what real life as a military pilot is and want to join because of it, which beyond, especially in the original Top Gun, countless things that would have seen you grounded permanently, such as the whole buzzing the tower thing, mostly life as a real military pilot is pretty mundane. As former FA-18 weapons systems officer Joe Russica states, "If anyone were to make a movie about real-life jet jocks, it would be boring as hell. The mundane outpaces the thrills by about 100 to 1. You think you get bored with your daily routine of eating, sleeping, and sitting behind a computer? Try doing it for 7 months at a time while trapped on an aircraft carrier with 5,000 of your closest friends." Commander Ronald Flanders further chimes in of the reality of being a fighter pilot in today's military. "Most of the aviation fighting is either providing eyes in the sky or occasionally dropping bombs on target. Very little of it is the glamorous air warfare that you see in Top Gun." That's not to mention that even the types of personalities depicted are the polar opposite of what, for example, the Top Gun program is looking for, as elaborated on by former Top Gun commanding officer Christopher Papiano. If they come in confident, overconfident, and cocky, that's not a personality that you can make better. They instead look for pilots who are, to quote, humble, who can go do an event, make a big comeback, recognize that they've made some mistakes, and be willing to critique themselves or allow us as instructors to make them better. Former Navy instructor pilot Jim Gibeau further states, "Nobody wants to risk their lives around a loose cannon, no matter how good they are at certain things. There's even a term for this, NAFOD, no apparent fear of death. These are the ones who'll get you killed with their recklessness." Now, sadly, you're almost never going to get a cool call sign like Iceman or Maverick either, with your call sign likely to be the most embarrassing thing that your fellow pilots can come up with about you, or something they witnessed you doing, informing what would ultimately be your call sign, with many simply being not family-friendly enough to repeat. As former naval pilot Chris Petrock succinctly states, "The thing that locks in the call sign is if the guy doesn't like it," or as the aforementioned Joe Russica notes of the pilots in the Top Gun films, "The most attractive people in flight suits you've ever seen. Trust me on the last part. When you serve with guys who look like their call signs, Pigger, Butthead, no one would pull them out of central casting." Thus, again, all coming back to that it's unlikely anyone is going to be truly convinced to enlist just because of something they saw in even the coolest of films like Top Gun, and somehow the even cooler Top Gun Maverick. Thus, once again, while many a pilot or former pilot in some branch of the US military may have been of the so-called Top Gun generation and inspired by the film, it may well be that movies like Top Gun simply appealed to them because of their pre-existing inclinations and interests, and thus they may have been likely to sign up anyway. However, as alluded to, direct inspiration isn't needed here to make these films a benefit to recruitment. There is something to be said for a general increase in public perception of the US military and the benefits that has on recruitment and the lives of the soldiers themselves. That's not to mention even as something of a propaganda tool abroad, generally making the US military look so dominant that you'd not want to mess with them. And at least for what it's worth, the Department of Defense definitively thinks that these sorts of films are both great for public perception of the military and great recruitment tools, worth making their equipment and personnel available for filming, so long as the military is painted in a reasonably positive light and it's reasonably accurate to reality in terms of how personnel would conduct themselves, at least ideally, given set policy. Humans are going to human, of course, and like every job, there are people who do it well and people who don't exactly live up to the normal standards of conduct. Or sometimes just a seemingly systemic bit of bad behavior that needs corrected right quick, such as the Navy's infamous tailhook scandal, in which a group of Marines and Navy personnel allegedly sexually assaulted as many as 7 men and 83 women in one night in a hotel in Las Vegas. Naturally, this resulted in some pretty sweeping and very long overdue and needed reforms. And to their credit, in recent years, the Department of Defense has supported some films and documentaries that depict such, as noted by the aforementioned Colonel Allen. We've done projects like The Invisible War, a 2012 American documentary film about some difficult, tough subjects like sexual assault in the military. It's not an easy thing to watch, and it's not an easy thing to talk about, but it's an important discussion. Speaking of rather uncomfortable topics, this brings us back to the benefits to the military on the public perception front, which, depending on your particular viewpoint, may constitute propaganda or not in a given case. As George Washington University Law School professor Jonathan Turley points out, propaganda denotes a certain product, a packaged news account, or film developed by a government or an organization to shape opinion. Yet this is not traditional propaganda, since the military does not generate the product itself and does not compel others to produce it. Rather, it achieves the same result through indirect influence, securing tailored historical accounts by withholding important resources. Semantics aside, even if one does consider this pure propaganda, there is something to be said for countering negative perception often put forth by the news, which generally has little interest in balanced reporting and is incentivized to report the bad actors and negative events in the military. For example, you're not going to see on the evening news a story of a US soldier saving some random life in some faraway place, but rather you'll hear about things like the tailhook scandal or the atrocities committed by the US in the Abu Ghraib prison and others during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. The news is also more likely to report on things like suicide rates of soldiers, post-traumatic stress disorder, subsequent alcohol and drug abuse, etc., rather than the number of soldiers who, after completing their service, use the self-discipline and many skills they learned during their time in the military, along with potential provided educational funding, to go and make a great life for themselves and their family directly because of their time in the US military. This negative side and controversy being more or less synonymous with news to get those sweet clicks instead of accurately portraying things in an objective manner overall. Thus, the military has a vested interest in getting a slightly more accurate, if also occasionally whitewashed on the other end of the spectrum, view of reality of the military and life in it out there. As the aforementioned liaison officer Todd Bresciale states of military support for films in this way, there's a lot to be said about the necessity to educate the American public about the military they're paying for. That said, as noted by cinema studies and cultural theory professor Alyssa Wilkinson, in the future, when those involved have passed away and our cultural relationship to the truth has only gotten more corrupted, how will we assess the truth about the ethically murky wars of the past several decades? Even if we know the facts and the film differ, will we care? What does it mean if the military has the financial power to say what version of history gets made? Countering that, Bresciale argues, there have been academics, very serious academics, who've written books about this sort of thing, who believe that any support whatsoever to the motion picture industry is necessarily propaganda. I just can't get there. I can't get my head around it, because it's not a black and white issue. Back again on the other side, showing his own concern, the aforementioned author David Robb states, the military is part of the US government. In America, we have the First Amendment, which prohibits government from favoring speech it likes and not favoring speech it doesn't like. You can't reward somebody who makes a movie saying how great the American government is and deny the same break to somebody criticizing it. The military are not filmmakers. They're good at making war and making weapons, but they're not good at making movies. They don't have a sense of humor, and they don't really even have a sense of their own history. Going back once again on the other side, it's also noted that beyond any perception problem, asking any member of the military to portray their work and their fellow soldiers in a negative light, especially when talking historical things, which may not be at all how the military does things these days, but nonetheless is going to cast themselves in a negative light in public perception anyway, isn't exactly a fair ask on an individual level. Nor would many taxpayers be happy if their money is being used to paint the US in a negative light, especially in many cases where it isn't historically accurate to reality and how the military would do or did things. Once again, as Bresciale states, it's not a black and white issue, which I think is something we can all agree on. And indeed, almost never is anything black and white, not even real-world representations of the color black and white, with people literally working tirelessly to make blacker blacks and whiter whites on screens and in paints and stuff like that. So how about we finish today's video off with some bonus Top Gun facts, because it's not long enough already. Despite having his pilot's license since 1994, no, Tom Cruise did not get to fly any of the scenes he was in the FA-18 or even touch the controls at all, other than the switch to activate the cameras the studio had installed. This is owing to Department of Defense rules that forbid, to quote, non-military personnel from controlling a Defense Department asset other than small arms in training scenarios. That said, he did get to fly in the scenes at the end, flying around in the World War II era few $1 million P-51 Mustang. As to why, on this one, it's because he's an adult and nobody could stop him because, well, it's his plane. His Mustang was originally built in 1946, ultimately finding its way into life as a museum piece in Illinois before being restored in 1997 and purchased by Cruise in 2001. He's been flying it ever since. No word on whether the studio compensated him on his flight hours on that one, although given his reported 10% cut of the gross of the film, which earned $1.5 billion, we're guessing either way he's not too upset. He's also not going to have to sell his Gulfstream 4, which apparently has a jacuzzi in it, because, well, why wouldn't you? Moving on from there, how about how realistic it was that Maverick absolutely destroyed his students in Top Gun Maverick? Former Top Gun senior instructor Dave Burke rings in on this, saying it's very accurate. Quote, "The most proficient instructor is significantly better than the most proficient student." Like a big, big, big difference. As for why, this just comes down to the instructors practice the scenarios over time massively more than the pilots taking the extra training at the school. Former Top Gun instructor Guy Snodgrass also concurred, stating that when he was being evaluated to become an instructor himself at Top Gun after graduating the course, he was likewise handily outmaneuvered and shot down by his instructor and figured he did poorly on the tests because of it. But not so, with his evaluator stating to him after, "No one ever beats their instructor," and where they felt he shines, and far more important to them, was his analysis of what he had done wrong and how he could improve next time. They were also in general evaluating his character and temperament in those defeats, all of which, in his case, were deemed ideal to become an instructor there. Once again illustrating the importance of finding pilots who are extremely teachable and willing to learn, rather than the more hotshot, overly confident Maverick types whose egos often get in the way of real improvement, and their rule-breaking a major liability to their fellow service members and respective missions. Moving on from there, going back to the agreement between the US military and the studio for Top Gun Maverick, if you know anything about the F-14 Tomcat, you're probably wondering where they got one flying, given the US military doesn't have that amazing jet anymore. And indeed, nobody has a flying one except for Iran, which, owing to sanctions, the film studio couldn't use. So how did the studio handle all of this for the film? In the agreement, it states that the F-14 shown during the ground scenes was borrowed from the National Naval Aviation Museum, and that they approved repaint the aircraft with the NNAM approved paint scheme, remove ejection seats for on-stage filming, and conduct maintenance to power aircraft, have control panel and exterior lights operational in support of filming. All costs related to transporting, painting, and maintenance are the production company's sole expense. It's a scene which is played out in countless medical dramas. The patient flatlines, the long, piercing tone of the heart monitor announces to the audience that they've shuffled off this mortal coil. But our team of intrepid medical heroes isn't ready to give up just yet, as one doctor pounds on the patient's chest, applies the kiss of life, another reaches for the twin metal paddles of a defibrillator. After a long, tense wait for the device to charge, the doctor places the paddles on the patient's chest, yells the obligatory "clear!" and zaps the patient with a massive jolt of electricity. A loud thunk is heard. The patient's chest heaves. And nothing. No pulse. The heart monitor continues to flatline, so our heroes try again and again and again, one of them slapping the patient's face and angrily yelling, "Live, damn you!" Then, after a suitably dramatic pause, the heart monitor suddenly resumes its regular rhythm. The patient's eyelids flutter and they cough and splutter back to life. The day is saved. While this is how most of us picture medical resuscitation, this familiar scene is pure Hollywood, an inaccurate hodgepodge of real-life procedures supercharged for maximum dramatic impact. In addition to leaving out key steps and grossly exaggerating the actual success rate of such interventions, nearly every popular depiction of medical resuscitation gets the use of defibrillators dead wrong. Far from being magic electric boxes capable of instantly jump-starting a stopped heart, defibrillators are in fact never used in cases of cardiac arrest and are only useful for treating a narrow range of cardiac emergencies. Indeed, using a defibrillator as indiscriminately as Hollywood doctors do would do far more harm to patients than good. So, how then do these misunderstood devices actually work, and how do real-life paramedics and doctors go about saving people from the brink of death? To understand how defibrillators work, it is first necessary to understand how the heart itself normally functions. Cardiac muscle cells are myogenic, or self-exciting, meaning they are capable of rhythmically contracting on their own without receiving any signals from the nervous system. Individually, however, these cells do not follow any set rhythm. In order for the heart to function properly as a whole, the contraction of all of its constituent cells must be coordinated. This is accomplished via a clump of specialized cardiac cells located in the right atrium called the sinoatrial or SA node, better known as a pacemaker. The SA node sends out regular electrical pulses, which are carried throughout the rest of the heart along special nerves known as Purkinje fibers. When the SA node fires, the pulse travels first through the atria at the top of the heart, causing them to contract and forcing blood through one-way valves into the ventricles below. The pulse then reaches another clump of nodal tissue known as the atrioventricular or AV node, which delays the pulse by 0.1 seconds before relaying it to the rest of the heart. This in turn causes the ventricles to contract and pump blood to the lungs and the rest of the body. The delay is necessary to ensure that the atria are fully emptied before the ventricles contract. This entire contraction phase is known as systole, followed by a second phase known as diastole, in which the cardiac muscles relax, allowing blood to flow into the atria. The SA node then fires again and the whole cycle begins anew. It is the firing of the SA node and not the actual contraction of the heart which is detected by an electrocardiogram or EKG heart monitor. Both the SA and AV nodes are capable of functioning on their own. Indeed, if a frog's heart is removed and placed in a saline solution, it will continue to beat with a regular rhythm for up to an hour. However, the rhythm at which the SA node fires, and thus the rate at which the heart beats, can be varied via a number of mechanisms. The autonomic nervous system, which controls the body's non-voluntary functions like breathing and digestion, consists of two main divisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, which have opposing effects on heart rate. The sympathetic nervous system stimulates the SA node and increases heart rate, inducing the so-called fight or flight or feed and breed response, while the parasympathetic nervous system slows the heart down, inducing the rest and digest response. The SA node can also be directly stimulated by the hormone epinephrine, better known as adrenaline, which is produced by the adrenal glands atop the kidneys and is also used to induce the fight or flight response. Other signals which can directly stimulate the SA node and increase heart rate include increased blood flow from the venous system and increased body temperature, commonly encountered, for example, when doing intense exercise. If the function of the heart's pacemaking system is interrupted, such as by a heart attack, electric shock, injury, toxins, or disease, a variety of dangerous irregular heart rhythms or arrhythmias can result, the two most common of which are ventricular fibrillation, or VFib, and ventricular tachycardia, or VTach. In ventricular fibrillation, the muscles of the ventricles contract irregularly, wriggling like a bag of worms, while in ventricular tachycardia, they contract uniformly but too rapidly, giving the ventricles insufficient time to fill with blood between contractions. The result in both cases is the loss of the heart's ability to effectively pump blood, leading to hypoxia or lack of oxygen to the brain and death within minutes without medical intervention. As the name suggests, it is these kind of arrhythmias which the defibrillator is designed to correct. The principle of defibrillation was first demonstrated in 1899 by Jean-Louis Prévost and Frédéric Batelli, two physiologists from the University of Geneva, who discovered that small electrical shocks could induce ventricular fibrillation in dogs, while larger shocks could reverse the condition. It would not be until the 1930s, however, that pioneers like American electrical engineer William Cohenhoven and cardiac surgeon Claude Beck began developing practical defibrillation devices for use on humans. Unlike most defibrillators we're used to seeing, these early devices were intended for use during surgery, the paddles being applied directly to the patient's exposed heart. Beck initially conducted his defibrillation experiments on lab animals until one day in 1947 when a 14-year-old patient went into ventricular fibrillation during surgery. In desperation, Beck ordered his crude experimental defibrillator brought up from his lab and applied 2 jolts to the patient's heart. To the world's absolute shock, the patient revived, the seemingly miraculous electrical resuscitation making headlines across the nation. Yet, despite this success, for years, the defibrillator remained a niche device used almost exclusively during surgery. This is because early devices ran on alternating current, and the use of AC voltages high enough to reach the heart through the unopened chest resulted in a number of unpleasant side effects, including broken ribs, electrical burns, and heart damage. It was not until the 1950s that William Cohenhoven, Soviet physician Naum Gurevich, and Czech physician Bohumil Paleska independently developed practical external defibrillators based on direct currents, which could be safely used without opening the patient's chest. Whatever the specific design, all defibrillators work the same by depolarizing the muscle and nerve cells of the heart and halting the arrhythmia. Much like turning off a device and turning it back on again to see if it fixes it, this effectively resets the heart, allowing the SA and AV nodes to take over and re-establish a healthy cardiac rhythm. While the output of most defibrillators can be adjusted depending on the application, most operate in the range of 3 to 400 joules. This is potentially hazardous to a healthy person, thus the cliched call of clear prior to administering a shock as a warning to all bystanders to remove their hands from the patient. Combined with CPR and the administration of antiarrhythmic drugs like procainamide, adenosine, and beta blockers, timely defibrillation can improve survival rates in cases of arrhythmia to as high as 74%. However, defibrillation only works if the heart already has its own electrical activity. In cases of asystole and pulseless electrical activity, more commonly known as cardiac arrest or flatlining, defibrillation has absolutely no effect. Yep. You heard that right. Despite what nearly every movie or TV show would have you believe, defibrillators are not in fact capable of kickstarting a stopped heart. Nor are they particularly useful for cardiac emergencies other than ventricular fibrillation or tachycardia. Indeed, using a defibrillator on the wrong cardiac rhythm can potentially make things worse, as a powerful electric shock can actually induce a deadly arrhythmia. For this reason, real-life paramedics and emergency room doctors do not use defibrillators indiscriminately, but rather wait until an EKG is hooked up to the patient to determine whether defibrillation is indicated. But when responding to a cardiac emergency, every second counts. Following the cutoff of oxygen to the brain, a victim's chances of survival go down by 7% for every minute for the first 3 minutes, and then 10% for every minute thereafter, with a high risk of irreversible brain damage after 3 to 5 minutes. Thus, the need to wait for paramedics to arrive and hook up an EKG prior to administering defibrillation once resulted in an extremely low survival rate for out-of-hospital heart attacks and other cardiac emergencies. In the 1970s, this problem inspired the invention of automated external defibrillators, or AEDs, compact units which could be placed in public areas for ready use and operated by untrained bystanders. Instead of paddles, most AEDs feature self-adhesive electrodes that are applied to the patient's chest, while many models include pictorial instructions and even spoken prompts to guide the operator through the device's operation. Most importantly, however, AEDs incorporate an EKG to analyze the victim's heart rhythm and determine whether defibrillation is required. If it is, then depending on the model, the AED will either deliver the shock automatically or prompt the operator to push a button to manually administer the shock. Such quick and ready access to defibrillation has had a dramatic impact on the outcome for heart attack victims. According to the American Heart Association, prior to AEDs, the survival rate for out-of-hospital heart attacks was less than 10%, while in areas where AEDs and cardiopulmonary resuscitation or CPR training is prevalent, those odds have risen to nearly 40%. While ventricular fibrillation and tachycardia are typically associated with heart attacks, electrocution, and other acute conditions, they can also be caused by chronic illnesses like coronary heart disease and cardiomyopathy. As this kind of arrhythmia is constant and recurring, sufferers are sometimes fitted with a device known as an automatic internal cardiac defibrillator, or AICD. This is similar to an artificial pacemaker, an implanted electronic device which simulates the function of a faulty sinoatrial node, and indeed many AICDs are capable of performing both functions. Via electrodes implanted in the heart, the AICD is able to detect dangerous fibrillation or tachycardia and automatically administer a defibrillating shock in order to keep the wearer's heart functioning normally. But if defibrillation cannot restart a stopped heart, then how do paramedics and emergency room doctors respond to cases of cardiac arrest? The first priority in such situations is to maintain the flow of blood and oxygen to the brain. This is accomplished either by trained bystanders or first responders via cardiopulmonary resuscitation, or CPR. This was yet another life-saving invention by the research team led by William Coenhoven, the early pioneer of defibrillation. In 1958, Coenhoven's colleague G. Guy Knickerbocker noticed that pressing the defibrillator paddles against a dog's heart caused the animal's blood pressure to rise. Based on this observation, Knickerbocker and his colleagues developed a system of manual cardiac massage to help correct fibrillation and tachycardia and maintain circulation in surgical patients suffering from cardiac arrest. This soon evolved into a closed chest resuscitation method composed of rhythmic chest compressions and artificial ventilation of the patient's lungs. Using this method, Knickerbocker was able to restore up to 40% of the patient's circulation, keeping the brain oxygenated and buying enough time for the heart to be restarted. While first responders and emergency room doctors typically use a mask or endotracheal tube with a hand-pumped resuscitation bag to ventilate patients, in a bystander situation, this can be accomplished using artificial respiration, known as rescue breathing or the kiss of life. Regular air contains about 20% oxygen, but the lungs absorb only about a quarter of this per breath, meaning that exhaled breath contains more than enough oxygen to sustain life. Currently, the American Heart Association's CPR guidelines recommend 30 full chest compressions, followed by 2 rescue breaths, although, as we'll get into shortly, research indicates outcomes are significantly improved by having individuals skip the breaths altogether and sticking strictly to compressions only until professional help arrives. In any event, amusingly, in order to maintain the recommended rhythm of around 100 chest compressions per minute, the AHA recommends that rescuers hum songs like the Bee Gees' Staying Alive, Queen's Another One Bites the Dust, or the Clash's Should I Stay or Should I Go? Less amusingly, in order to adequately compress the heart through the ribcage, the AHA also recommends compressing the chest as much as 2 to 3 inches. Thus, real-life CPR is far less clean and tidy than depicted in films and TV, often resulting in broken ribs and other painful injuries. Still, this is more price to pay for potentially staying alive. And if things go the other way, well, you're not going to care anyway, are you? As previously noted, while combined chest compressions and rescue breathing have been part of the AHA's guidelines since their introduction in 1974, more recent research suggests the rescue breathing component may in fact be counterproductive and that chest compressions alone may actually give a higher chance of survival than traditional CPR. For example, according to a 2008 study by Dr. Gordon Newey of the University of Arizona College of Medicine, while survival rates for victims of out-hospital cardiac arrests receiving traditional CPR have remained consistently low for nearly 50 years, compression-only CPR, known as cardiocerebral resuscitation or CCR, has been shown to improve these odds by up to 300%. But how can this be? Shouldn't rescue breathing improve the oxygenation of the blood and the survival of the brain? Well, according to Uwe, artificial respiration also increases air pressure in the chest cavity, compressing blood vessels and reducing overall blood circulation. Chest compressions alone, by contrast, compress the lungs sufficiently to adequately oxygenate the blood while simultaneously maintaining blood circulation, which, if stopping for breaths, both stops the circulation, and it takes several compressions to build the pressure and circulation back up after, extending the blood flow interruption every breath. But whichever method is used, CPR is only intended to maintain the patient's circulation and stave off permanent brain damage until the heart can be restarted, a condition known in emergency medicine as return of spontaneous circulation, or ROSC. While it is possible for this to occur due to the CPR itself, this is vanishingly rare, and ROSC is usually achieved naturally or through the use of various drugs. The most common drug used in resuscitation is the hormone epinephrine or adrenaline, which, as previously mentioned, directly stimulates the sinoatrial nerve and increases heart rate. The neurotransmitter dopamine and the alkaloid atropine, derived from the deadly nightshade plant, are sometimes used for this purpose. These cardiac stimulants are often used in conjunction with a variety of vasoconstricting drugs such as vasopressin, norepinephrine, and dobutamine, which contract blood vessels and increase blood pressure. This is especially important when using epinephrine, as this drug is a vasodilator and can induce dangerous hypotension or low blood pressure. Sadly, however, while these drug combinations have been standard practice in emergency rooms for decades, no drug has been definitively shown to improve survival outcomes in cases of cardiac arrest, meaning that most cases of the patient's heart spontaneously restarting are likely unrelated to medical intervention. Nonetheless, without the early and consistent application of CPR, these patients would likely not have lasted long enough for their hearts to start. According to the American Heart Association, while the survival rate of out-of-hospital cardiac arrests without intervention is around 10%, with immediate CPR intervention, this increases nearly threefold. So, despite what movies and TV would have you believe, in real life the key to restarting a stopped heart is not some magic electrical box, but rather a combination of early and sustained CPR, stimulant drugs, and a whole lot of luck.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main beam bus on a volt.
These words, spoken by astronaut Jim Lovell on April 13, 1970, signaled the start of one of NASA's greatest crises. Apollo 13, the third American lunar landing mission, had suffered an onboard explosion, knocking out vital systems and placing the lives of 3 astronauts, Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert, in grave danger. Over the next 4.5 days, thousands of engineers and technicians back on Earth battled one crisis after another to keep the crippled spacecraft running and bring the astronauts safely back home. Their heroic efforts paid off when on April the 17th, the command module Odyssey splashed down in the South Pacific Ocean, and astronauts Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert were brought aboard the aircraft carrier USS Iwo Jima, safe and sound. The saga of Apollo 13 has been described as a successful failure and NASA's finest hour, and was famously dramatized in the acclaimed 1995 film starring Tom Hanks, Bill Paxton, and Kevin Bacon. But while the film is praised for its historical and technical accuracy, it by necessity takes certain liberties for the sake of drama. For example, shortening Lovell's rather passive real-life declaration to the far more urgent "Houston, we have a problem." But what else did the film get right and wrong, and what actually caused the Apollo 13 disaster? Well, let's find out as we take a deep dive into one of the greatest dramas in the history of manned spaceflight. Apollo 13 was the 7th manned mission of the Apollo program, which had been launched in response to US President John F. Kennedy's May 25, 1961 challenge of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. The sheer magnitude and ambition of this goal cannot be overstated. At the time, NASA's total manned spaceflight experience amounted to only 15 minutes and 28 seconds, flown by astronaut Alan Shepard during the suborbital Mercury Redstone 3 mission on May 5th. Yet in spite of Kennedy's seemingly impossible deadline, NASA took a conservative, incremental approach to cracking this massive technical problem, with each mission expanding only slightly on the capabilities of the one before. For instance, the 6 one-man missions of Project Mercury, flown between 1961 and 1963, demonstrated that American astronauts could live and work effectively in space. This was followed by Project Gemini, whose 10 missions, flown between 1965 and 1966, allowed NASA to perfect all the techniques and equipment it would need to land on the moon, including orbital rendezvous and docking, extravehicular activity, and the use of hydrogen fuel cells and other technologies. When the Apollo program itself finally got underway, it too followed the same incremental scheme. For instance, missions SA-1 to SA-5, AS-101 to AS-105, and AS-201 to AS-203, and Apollo 4 to 6, flown between 1961 and 1968, were all unmanned test flights of the Saturn I, Saturn 1B, and Saturn V launch vehicles, and the Apollo Command Service Module and Lunar Module spacecraft, aka the CSM and LEM. Apollo 7, the first manned mission, was flown by astronauts Walter Scheer, Don Eisel, and Walter Cunningham between October the 11th and the 22nd, 1968, and tested out the Apollo CSM systems in orbit. Apollo 11 was originally supposed to test the lunar module, but recent Soviet spaceflight accomplishments compelled NASA to switch to a far bolder mission profile. So it was that on December the 21st, 1968, astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders blasted off from Cape Canaveral atop a massive Saturn V rocket. 70 hours later, they entered lunar orbit, becoming the first humans to visit another world. The test of the lunar module, originally scheduled for Apollo 8, was pushed to Apollo 9, flown in Earth orbit by James McDivitt, David Scott, and Russell Rusty Schweikart between March the 3rd and the 13th, 1969. All the pieces came together on May 18th, 1969, when Thomas Stafford, Gene Cernan, and John Young blasted off the launch pad. As a full dress rehearsal, Apollo 10 saw the astronauts perform every step of the Apollo mission profile short of actually landing on the moon. Indeed, the lunar module carried on this mission was intentionally too heavy and its tanks only half filled, so that even if the astronauts had been tempted to attempt a landing, they would have not been able to lift off again. Apollo 10 was a complete success, the crew safely returning to Earth on May 26th. In the process, they reached a speed of 39,897 kilometers per hour, the fastest ever attained by a manned vehicle. 8 years to the day since President Kennedy first set his challenge, all the equipment and procedures needed to land a man on the moon had been perfected. But it had not all been smooth sailing, with the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs suffering several near misses and one tragic disaster. For example, during the suborbital Mercury Redstone 4 mission on July the 21st, 1961, a hatch malfunction just after splashdown nearly led to astronaut Gus Grissom drowning in the Atlantic Ocean. 2 years later, on May 15, 1963, an electrical malfunction during Mercury Atlas 9 caused astronaut Leroy Gordo Cuba's capsule Faith 7 to lose all navigational and guidance data, forcing him to pilot his spacecraft back to Earth manually. A more hair-raising emergency cropped up on March the 16th, 1966, during Gemini 8, flown by Neil Armstrong and David Scott. Shortly after docking with the unmanned Gina target vehicle, the two spacecraft entered an uncommanded roll, quickly picking up speed. Assuming the problem was the Agena, Armstrong decided to undock. However, the Gemini capsule continued to tumble faster and faster, soon reading 50 RPM and subjecting Armstrong and Scott to approximately -1 G of acceleration and threatening to cause them to black out. Realizing the roll was caused by a stuck thruster in the Orbital Attitude and Maneuvering System, or OAMS, Armstrong shut down that system, engaged the Re-entry Control System, or RCS, and in a masterful display of piloting and coolness under pressure, managed to bring the spacecraft back under control. However, mission rules dictated that the mission be aborted if the RCS was engaged for any reason, so Armstrong and Scott began their re-entry procedures and returned safely to Earth without achieving any of their mission objectives. Having avoided major catastrophes time and time again, NASA was riding high and went into the Apollo program supremely confident in ultimate success. But this confidence and momentum came to a screeching halt on January the 27th, 1967, during a dress rehearsal for Apollo 1, the first manned mission of the program. Crewed by Mercury and Gemini veteran Gus Grissom, Ed White, the first American astronaut to perform an extravehicular activity or spacewalk, and rookie Roger Chaffee, Apollo 1 was scheduled for launch on February the 21st and intended to prove out the Block 1 Apollo spacecraft in Earth orbit. On the afternoon of January 27th, the crew were sealed into their capsule atop its Saturn 1B launch vehicle for a so-called plugs-out test designed to demonstrate that the craft could function properly on full internal power. The test was beset with problems from the start, with poor radio communications, leading Grissom to gripe, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" Then, at 6:31:06 p.m. local time, a chilling message came over the radio. "We've got a fire in the cockpit." Other frantic, garbled cries followed. Then silence. Pad crews rushed to the gantry to find black smoke and toxic fumes pouring out of the spacecraft hatch. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to get the hatch open in time, and all 3 astronauts perished. The Apollo 1 fire sent shockwaves through NASA, shattering the agency's confidence and bringing the entire Apollo program under intense scrutiny. A subsequent inquiry uncovered a long list of factors which contributed to the disaster, though the ultimate cause of the fire was never determined. For example, the extensive use of nylon and other flammable materials in the cabin, combined with the pressurized pure oxygen environment, had allowed the fires to rage out of control, while the hatch design, which took 90 seconds to open, even under ideal circumstances, had prevented the astronauts from escaping in time. The ultimate cause, however, was the culture of haste and complacency at NASA, which had allowed all these questionable design choices to creep into the Apollo spacecraft. In the wake of this disaster, the agency thoroughly overhauled its safety policies and procedures, and the Apollo spacecraft was redesigned. Among hundreds of changes, the new Block 2 design featured a new hatch that could be opened in 5 seconds and a cabin atmosphere that switched from a less flammable nitrogen-oxygen mix at launch to pure oxygen once in space. Much of the nylon used throughout the spacecraft into the astronaut spacesuits was also changed to a less flammable Teflon-coated fiberglass material called beta cloth. However, some flammable material still remained, material which, as we shall see, would ultimately contribute to the Apollo 13 disaster. Now, with the safe return of Apollo 10 on May 26, 1969, it was finally time for NASA to go all the way and actually land a human on the moon. The late President Kennedy's dream was finally realized at 3:17 p.m. on July the 20th, 1969, when the Apollo 11 lunar module, Eagle, touched down in the Sea of Tranquility. 3.5 hours later, with nearly 20% of the world's population watching live on television, Mission Commander Neil Armstrong climbed down the ladder of the LEM descent stage, stepped onto the lunar surface, and spoke the immortal words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." He was soon joined by lunar module pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and the two set about the business of collecting geological samples, setting up experiments, planting the American flag, and the dozens of other tasks that they'd been assigned. Due to the precarious nature of their pioneering mission, Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the lunar surface for only 2 hours, 21 minutes, and 40 seconds before climbing back onto the LM, lifting off and rejoining command module pilot Michael Collins back in lunar orbit. The trio then began their journey back to Earth, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean on July the 24th and returning home to a hero's welcome. And if for some reason you don't believe we actually landed on the moon, or know someone who does, why not check out our previous video, How Do We Actually Know We Landed on the Moon? So, now that NASA had proven it could land men on the moon and return them safely to the Earth, the Apollo program entered a new phase focused on scientific exploration. The various Apollo mission profiles were designated by a letter, with the unmanned Apollo 4, 5, and 6 missions being A and B type missions, Apollo 7 was a C mission, Apollo 8 a C prime mission, Apollo 9 a D mission, Apollo 10 an F mission, and Apollo 11 a G mission. An E-type mission, in which the Apollo CSM and LEM would be tested in medium Earth orbit, was originally planned, but scrapped in favor of the more ambitious F-type mission of Apollo 10. The H-type missions that would follow Apollo 11 were more ambitious, with the crews carrying out precision landings at carefully chosen geophysical sites of interest and performing more and longer EVAs and scientific experiments. The first of these, Apollo 12, was crewed by Charles P. Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon, and lifted up from Cape Canaveral on November 14, 1969. Despite a nearly disastrous liftoff in which the Saturn V rocket was struck by lightning, the crew made it safely to the moon, with Conrad and Bean touching down in the Ocean of Storms on November the 19th. Conrad managed to set the lunar module Intrepid down just 163 meters from the unmanned Space Surveyor 3, which had previously landed on April the 20th, 1967. He and Bean later removed parts of the probe and returned them to Earth so NASA engineers could study the effects of the lunar environment on flight hardware. Over the next 36.5 hours, Conrad and Bean performed 2 EVAs, totaling 7 hours, 45 minutes before lifting off from the lunar surface, the command module Yankee Clipper splashing down in the Pacific Ocean on November the 24th, 1969. With the initial goal of Apollo accomplished and Congress starting to claw back the agency's budget, NASA decided to slow down the pace of the program, reducing its launch schedule from 5 to only 2 launches per year. This would not only help save money, but also give scientists more time to analyze the findings of each mission. Compared to previous missions, Apollo 13 placed a greater emphasis on geology and geophysics. For its landing site, geologists chose the Fra Mare Highlands, located within the Mare Imbrium, or Sea of Rains, in the Moon's northwest quadrant. Most recognizable as the right eye of the man in the moon, Mare Imbrium is the second largest mare, or lava plain, on the lunar surface, second only to Oceanus Procellarum. Formed by the impact of a 250-kilometer-wide protoplanet during the late heavy bombardment approximately 4 billion years ago, the Imbrium Basin was later flooded by basaltic lava from another impact whose ejecta also created the Fra Mauro Formation. Apollo geologists were particularly interested in the small cone crater to the north of Fra Mauro, which was young and deep enough to have punched through any material deposited since the Imbrium event and into the Fra Mauro Formation itself. By having Apollo 13 astronauts collect ejecta samples from Cone Crater, geologists hope to pinpoint the age of the Imbrium event and gain insights into the early history of the Earth and the Moon. In addition to collecting rock samples, the Apollo 13 astronauts were also tasked with setting up a more advanced version of the Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, or ALSA. Apollo 11 had deployed a stripped-down version of this system called the Early Apollo Surface Experiments Package, or ESUP, comprising a laser-ranging retroreflector, or LRRR, and a solar-powered passive seismic experiment package, or PSEP. While the former is still used to this day to measure the distance between the Earth and the Moon, the latter failed after only 21 days. Apollo 12 was more successful, deploying a full version of ALSA powered by a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, or RTG, which converted the radioactive decay heat from a capsule of plutonium-238 into electricity. The Apollo 12 ALSEP included 5 experiments: a passive seismic experiment, or PSE, for measuring moonquakes, a lunar surface magnetometer, or LSM, a solar wind spectrometer, or SWS, for measuring charged particles streaming from the sun, the suprathermal ion detector experiment, or SIDE, for detecting the presence of lunar ionosphere, and a cold cathode ion gauge, or CCIG, for measuring the density of the thin lunar atmosphere. Apollo 13's ALSEP was similar, featuring a PSE and a modified version of the CCIG called the Cold Cathode Gauge Experiment, or CCGE, but introducing 2 new experiments: the Shared Particle Lunar Environment Experiment, or CPLE, and the Heat Flow Experiment, or HFE. The latter experiment measured the flow of heat through the Moon's interior and required the astronauts to drill 2 3-meter-deep boreholes in the lunar surface for a pair of thermal probes. All lunar surface activities were to be carried out over 4 extravehicular activities, or EVAs, lasting 4 hours each. And to learn more about the fascinating design of the various ALSEP packages deployed by all the Apollo missions, why not check out the comprehensive video on the subject over on Our Own Devices, the personal channel of the author of today's video, Gilles Messier. Another change to Apollo 13's experiment was an improved lunar flag assembly, aka the pole that held up the American flag on the airless lunar surface. The latch on Apollo 12's LFA had failed, causing the flag to droop at an angle, so an improved double latch design was introduced for Apollo 13. Also, for the first time, red stripes were placed on the helmet, arms, and legs of the mission commander's A7L spacesuit, so he and the lunar module pilot could more easily be distinguished in photographs, a problem which had plagued the 2 previous missions. Both spacesuits were also fitted with drinking water bags inside the helmets to help keep the astronauts hydrated while working on the lunar surface. Concerned about how close Apollo 11's lunar module, Eagle, had come to running out of propellant during landing, mission planners decided to implement a new landing procedure. On Apollo 13, the Command Service Module, or CSM, would descend to a lower orbit before releasing the lunar module, leaving the latter with more fuel to complete its descent to the lunar surface. The more northerly latitude of Apollo 13's landing site also forced planners to adopt a different flight profile. Earlier missions had used what is known as a free return trajectory, which guaranteed that if the crew were unable to perform any further burns, they would automatically swing around the moon and return to Earth. However, this trajectory only allowed for landings near the lunar equator. Therefore, Apollo 13 would use a hybrid free return trajectory, which required the crew to make 2 correction burns to place them in the correct re-entry corridor. If either of these burns went wrong, they would miss the Earth by hundreds of kilometers. It was a significant risk, but a necessary one. The astronauts were assigned a variety of miscellaneous scientific tasks, such as photographing the Earth's surface at regular intervals to determine the effectiveness of this technique for tracking major weather patterns. The S-4B rocket stage that would launch Apollo 13 from Earth orbit toward the moon was also programmed to impact the lunar surface, generating seismic waves that would be picked up and transmitted to Earth by the Apollo 12 RCEP. These readings would provide valuable data about the interior structure of the moon. Finally, the crew was tasked with making a number of live color television broadcasts throughout the mission, a spaceflight first that NASA hoped would help sustain public interest in the space program. Now, according to NASA's standard Apollo crew rotation scheme, the prime crew for Apollo 13 should have been the backup crew for Apollo 10. Commander Leroy Gordo Cooper, a veteran of the Mercury Atlas 9 and Gemini 5 missions, Command Module Pilot, or CMP, Don F. Eisel, who had flown on Apollo 7, and Lunar Module Pilot, or LMP, Edgar Mitchell, a rookie astronaut. However, by this time, Cooper and Eisel had fallen out of favor within NASA, Cooper because of his lax attitude toward training, and Eisel due to insubordinate behavior during the Apollo 7 mission and an extramarital affair which threatened the clean-cut image of the astronaut corps. Former Mercury astronaut and head of the astronaut office, Donald K. Deke Slayton, thus removed Cooper and Eisel from prime rotation and replaced them with Commander Alan Shepard, the first American in space, and CMP Stuart Roosa, another rookie. As a result of this decision, Cooper resigned from NASA in 1970. Unfortunately, George Mueller, the director of NASA's Office of Manned Spaceflight, rejected Slayton's crew assignment. Alan Shepard had only recently been restored to flight status after undergoing corrective surgery for Meniere's disease, an inner ear disorder which had kept him grounded since 1963. Mueller believed Shepard to be too inexperienced to command an Apollo mission and requested that he and his crew be given more time to train. As a result, Shepard, Mitchell, and Roosa were bumped to Apollo 14, and the backup crew for Apollo 11, consisting of Commander Jim Lovell, CMP Ken Mattingly, and LMP Fred Hayes, swapped in for Apollo 13. In the movie Apollo 13, this crew change is inaccurately described by Jim Lovell as being due to Al Shepard's ear infection flaring up again. When approached about the swap, the real-life Lovell, originally slated to command Apollo 14, reportedly replied, "Sure, why not? What could possibly be the difference between Apollo 13 and Apollo 14? At the time, 41-year-old Jim Lovell was the most experienced astronaut in the American space program, with a whopping 572 total hours, or about 24 days logged in space. A graduate of the University of Wisconsin and the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, Lovell flew as a naval aviator aboard the aircraft carrier USS Shangri-La and completed a test pilot course at the Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River before being selected in 1962 as part of the New Nine, NASA's second group of astronauts. Lovell first flew into space on December 4, 1965, aboard Gemini 7, a long-endurance mission which saw him and co-pilot Frank Borman spend a record 14 days in Earth orbit. 1 year later, on November 11, 1966, Lovell returned to space alongside Buzz Aldrin aboard Gemini 12, the last mission of the Gemini program. Lovell, along with Frank Borman and Bill Anders, was also on the crew of Apollo 8, which in December 1968 made the historic first flight around the moon. Lovell's Apollo 13 crewmates, by contrast, were both rookies. Ken Mattingly, also a former naval aviator, had served aboard the USS Saratoga and USS Franklin D. Roosevelt before being selected as part of NASA's Astronaut Group 5 in 1966. He served as Capsule Communicator, or CAPCOM, for the Apollo 8 mission before being assigned as backup crew for Apollo 11. Fred Hayes flew for multiple branches of the U.S. Armed Forces, serving in the U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine Corps, Oklahoma Air National Guard, and the 185th Fighter Interceptor Squadron before becoming a test pilot and flying for NASA at the Lewis Research Center in Ohio. Like Ken Mattingly, he joined NASA in 1966 as part of Astronaut Group 5, serving as backup lunar module pilot for Apollo 8 and 11. The backup crew for Apollo 13 comprised Commander John Young, a veteran of Geminis 3 and 10, and Apollo 10 CMP Jack Swigert and LMP Charles Duke, both rookies. As per tradition, the prime crew were allowed to choose the insignia, motto, and spacecraft call signs for their mission. The Apollo 13 insignia, designed by artist Luman Winter, featured 3 horses representing the chariot of Apollo, ancient Greek god of the sun, flying from the Earth to the moon, along with the motto Ex Luna Scientia, from the moon, knowledge. Lovell adapted this motto from that of his alma mater at Annapolis, Ex Scientia, Tridens, or From Knowledge, See Power. This motto also informed Lovell's choice for the name of Apollo 13's lunar module, Aquarius, the water bearer. Meanwhile, the Command Service Module, or CSM, was dubbed Odyssey, a nod to the groundbreaking 1968 Stanley Kubrick science fiction film 2001: A Space Odyssey, as well as the words Homeric implications, a long voyage with many changes in fortune. As we shall see, this choice was to prove extremely prophetic. The film Apollo 13 implies that the switch from Shepard's to Lovell's crews occurred at the last minute, giving the latter only a few months to train. In reality, the reassignment was decided in the summer of 1969, while Apollo 13 was scheduled for launch in March 1970. On January the 9th, 1970, this was further pushed back to April. Launch windows for Apollo missions were chosen based on a variety of factors. For example, a daytime launch was preferred to aid with crew recovery in case of abort. Indeed, the only nighttime launch of the program was its last, Apollo 17, on December the 7th, 1972. Daylight conditions were also preferred for the lunar landing. The location of the launch range at Cape Canaveral dictated the azimuth, aka the horizontal angle, at which the Saturn V rocket could be launched, while the location of communications and tracking antennas and recovery forces around the globe placed restrictions on where the spacecraft would perform its translunar injection or TLI burn and where it could splash down. If Apollo 13 could not launch in April, the next available launch window was between May the 9th and the 11th. Nonetheless, there was still plenty to do, and over the following year, both prime and backup crews underwent more than 1,000 hours of mission-specific training. In addition to spending countless hours in various simulators, Lovell, Hayes, Young, and Duke trained for landing on the moon by flying helicopters and the Lunar Landing Training Vehicle, or LLTV, a strange and dangerous contraption comprising a vertical jet engine with legs which the astronauts nicknamed the Flying Bedstead. Due to the added emphasis on geological exploration, the moonwalkers also conducted extensive field work in Kapoho, Hawaii, Oricopes and Mono Crater in California, Meteor Crater in Arizona, and Kilbourne Hole in New Mexico, under the mentorship of geologists Farouk Albaz and Lee Silver, learning to make geological observations and report them accurately over the radio. Command Module pilots, Mattingly and Swigert, also studied under Albaz and Silver, flying over various landscapes in light aircraft and learning to spot and photograph relevant geological features. Meanwhile, preparation of Apollo 13's flight hardware was already well underway, having begun during the final lead-up to Apollo 11. On June 26, 1969, the CSM Odyssey was flown by Aerospace Line's Super Guppy aircraft from manufacturer North American Rockwell in California to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where systems integration testing began. These tests revealed a number of minor technical issues requiring various components, including a VHF antenna, fuse module, hydrogen fuel cell, and part of the heat shield to be replaced or repaired. The lunar module Aquarius later arrived from Grumman Aircraft in Long Island and was also found to have various issues requiring its gaseous oxygen shut-off valves, a glycol coolant line, and propulsion system helium modules to be replaced. However, such reworks were nothing out of the ordinary and had been carried out on all previous missions. On November 12th, however, a hydrogen tank on Apollo 12's CSM Yankee Clipper, scheduled to launch in 2 days, began acting up. NASA thus decided to swap it with Odyssey's tank, allowing the launch to proceed on schedule. On December 11th, 1969, Odyssey was taken to the Vertical Assembly Building, or VAB, and mated with its Saturn V booster, which on December 15th was rolled out using the crawler transporter to Pad A at the Kennedy Space Center's Launch Complex 39. Full pre-launch tests, in which all propellants were pumped into the rocket and all countdown procedures performed short of actual launch, were conducted between March 18th and 25th, 1970, whereupon the prime crew conducted a full launch rehearsal with the tanks empty. On April 5th, launch director Walter Caprian started the final countdown, with the launch scheduled for 2:13 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on April the 11th. That same day, the prime crew passed their final physical examinations. In spite of its auspicious number, Apollo 13 appeared set to launch without any major complications. It was then that Dr. Charles Berry, chief physician for the mission, dropped a bombshell. On April the 4th, 7 days before the launch, backup LMP Charlie Duke contracted rubella, aka German measles, from his son's friend. Blood tests for antibodies were immediately performed on both prime and backup crews, revealing that of all 6 astronauts, only prime CMP Ken Mattingly did not possess prior immunity. On April the 9th, NASA Administrator Dr. Thomas O. Paine flew from Washington to the Kennedy Space Center to discuss the situation with astronaut office head Deke Slayton, manned spaceflight chief Dale Mars, Apollo program director Dr. Rocker Petrone, mission director Chester Lee, and public affairs director Julian Scheer. all agreed that Mattingly should be grounded. The risk of him coming down with the measles at a critical point in the mission was simply too great. Ordinarily, if any member of the prime crew was grounded, then the rest of the crew would also be grounded and the backup crew swapped in. However, Charlie Duke's illness made this impossible. Delaying the launch until either crew was flight ready was also less than desirable, given the high costs associated with operating the worldwide tracking and communications network and dispatching the recovery fleet to the prime recovery area in the South Pacific. Also, the longer the spacecraft remained on the pad, the more its corrosive nitrogen tetroxide and hydrazine propellants would damage the engine and thruster hardware, increasing maintenance costs. As a result, the unusual decision was made to replace Mattingly with backup CMP Jack Swigert. Though Swigert was more than qualified to fly the mission, having more than 400 hours of training under his belt, only around 10 of these had been spent with Lovell and Hayes. Nonetheless, there were no better options, and on April the 10th, Dr. Payne announced his decision to the press. At 7 p.m. that evening, the crew began their 9-hour rest period, being woken at 4:13 a.m. the following morning. They then ate breakfast, dressed in their spacesuits, and were driven by van to Pad A, where they rode an elevator up to the White Room at the top of the gantry. In the film, Apollo 13, the insertion of the astronauts into the capsule and the closeout of the gantry is accurately shown being directed by Gunter Wendt, a German-born employee of North American Rockwell, affectionately dubbed Der Führer of the Launch Pad by the astronauts. In real life, however, Jim Lovell's wisecrack, "I wonder here, Gunter Wendt," was actually spoken by Don Eisel during the Apollo 7 mission. Meanwhile, at the Manned Spacecraft Center, today the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, Mission Control was going through its final pre-flight checks. In the film, the mission is shown being directed throughout by Gene Kranz. In reality, Kranz was one of 4 flight directors, each with their own team working in rotation. Kranz led White Team, Glyn Lunny Black Team, Milton Windler Maroon Team, and Jerry Griffin Gold Team. The real-life Kranz also never said that failure is not an option. That line was invented for the film. He did, however, wear distinctive vests specifically sewn by his wife for every mission, the one worn during Apollo 13 being white to reflect his status as leader of White Team. Despite fading public interest in the Apollo program, the launch of Apollo 13 was watched live by over 5,000 invitees, including Vice President Spiro Agnew, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, and a 1,000-man press corps. Notably absent, however, was Ken Mattingly, who, unlike in the film, had already flown to Houston to act as capsule communicator or Capcom alongside fellow astronauts Joe Kerwin, Vance Brand, Jack Loosma, and John Young. Similarly, while the film depicts Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes watching the July 20th, 1969 landing of Apollo 11 from Lovell's house in Houston, the reality was that the two were actually serving as capsule communicators or Capcoms at Mission Control. Finally, the film depicts the astronauts saying farewell to their families from across a road so as not to contract any germs, a practice which did not begin until the Space Shuttle program. The countdown was largely uneventful, save for an incident at T-1 hour 50 minutes, when a vent valve in the first stage oxygen tank failed to close, preventing the tank from pressurizing. However, gaseous nitrogen fed into the system quickly thawed the valve, allowing it to close and the countdown to continue. Apollo 13 roared off the launch pad right on schedule at 2:13 p.m. and soared into a clear sky over Cape Canaveral. In the film, this event is shown fairly accurately, save for a few minor details. For example, in reality, the service arms on the gantry retracted all at once, rather than in sequence. The Saturn V rocket wore a different scheme of black roll stripes, and the engine bells of the first stage F1 engines were covered in a thick layer of insulation. 5 minutes and 30 seconds after launch, Apollo 13 suffered its second minor hiccup as the center engine of the rocket's S2 stage eventually shut down. This failure was caused by a phenomenon known as pogo oscillation, longitudinal vibrations caused by the interplay between combustion instability and propellant flow. It was later determined that the pressure in the stage's liquid oxygen, or LOX tank, was slightly low, causing tiny vapor bubbles to form in the center engine's oxidizer turbo pump, a phenomenon known as cavitation. This caused vibrations in the performance of the engines, which fed back into the flow rate of the fuel, and so on, causing pogo oscillation. Thankfully, however, Mission Control quickly determined that the failure was not mission critical, so long as no other engines shut down, and the other S2 engines were simply burned longer to compensate for the loss of thrust. As Jim Lovell states in the film, both the astronauts and Mission Control believed they had encountered their major glitch for the mission. 20 minutes and 39 seconds after liftoff, Apollo 13 entered a 190-kilometer circular parking orbit around the Earth. This event added yet more feathers to Jim Lovell's cap, making him the first man to go into space 4 times, the first to fly the Saturn V twice, and the first to fly to the moon twice. The former record would only be beaten on April 5, 1981, when fellow Gemini and Apollo astronaut John Young made his fifth spaceflight aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia during the STS-1 mission. The crew remained in Earth orbit for the next 2.5 hours, going through a very long 31-step insertion and systems check checklist. Then, at last, they performed their translunar injection, TLI burn, firing the S-4B third stage for 5 minutes and 49 seconds to accelerate them to a blistering 38,400 kilometers per hour. Apollo 13 was on its way to the moon. Shortly after the TLI, Command Module pilot Jack Swigert carried out the transposition and docking maneuver, separating the CSM and flipping it around before docking with and extracting the lunar module from its shroud stop atop the S-4B stage. In the film, the procedure is depicted accurately, save for 2 details. Due to the high risk of collision and possible cabin depressurization, transposition and docking was carried out with the crew still wearing their spacesuits. Jack Swigert is also depicted as an inexperienced pilot, with there seeming to be tension on whether or not he could successfully perform the docking, and indeed, in the movie, he accidentally scrapes the CSM's probe against the LEM's drogue. Of course, in reality, if there was any question whatsoever that Swigert could perform this procedure successfully, he wouldn't have been allowed to even try. Thus, unsurprisingly, in reality, the highly trained astronaut performed the docking exercise perfectly. With the 2 spacecraft securely docked, the crew of Apollo 13 settled in for their 3-day journey to the moon. Meanwhile, the S-4B stage carried on along its pre-programmed rendezvous with the lunar surface. On April 12th, 30 hours and 40 minutes into the mission, the crew prepared to make their first mid-course correction, or MCC burn, to place themselves on the correct trajectory to reach for the far Mara Highlands. Indeed, Apollo 13 would perform 2 major and 7 minor burns throughout the mission, only one of which is depicted in the film for the sake of narrative efficiency. Before the burn could be performed, however, Jack Swigert had to align the spacecraft's primary guidance, navigation, and control system, or PGNCS, pronounced by flight controllers and astronauts alike as PINGs. This consisted of the Apollo Guidance Computer, or AGC, and the Inertial Measurement Unit, or IMU, a set of gyroscopes and accelerometers. To provide the IMU with a fixed reference against which to measure the spacecraft's orientation, the astronauts used a special sextant to sight stars and other celestial objects in the sky. With the IMU aligned and the first MCC burn complete, Swigert placed Odyssey and Aquarius into a slow, passive thermal control, or PTC roll, designed to even out the heating effects of the sun on the spacecraft's exterior. Now, for obvious reasons, this maneuver was nicknamed the barbecue roll, though we might suggest the rotisserie maneuver would have been more fitting. Other tasks performed by the crew during this period included taking a series of 10 weather tracking photos of the receding Earth and connecting an electrical umbilical cable between the 2 spacecraft, allowing the hydrogen fuel cells in the CSM to power the LEM systems until the latter undocked for its descent to the lunar surface. In the process, the crew made an amusing discovery. Someone had labeled a secondary computer system display panel HAL after the evil computer from the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Following their first 5-hour sleep period, the astronauts ate breakfast while Capcom Joe Kerwin read them that day's news, which was dominated by the recent breakup of the Beatles. This is also mentioned in the film, much to the distress of Lovell's older daughter Barbara, though the album Let It Be that she showed holding was not released until May the 8th. Also not at his best that morning was Fred Hayes, who later recalled, "On the morning of the second day, I woke up with a pretty severe headache. I drank some juice and ate some bacon cubes. That didn't sit right, and I upchucked about 2 ounces of my juice. I sat still for about half a day pretty much. I never had any symptoms again after that." Hayes' nausea was likely caused by the poorly understood phenomenon of space sickness, likely caused by a disconnect between what the astronauts' eyes see and what their inner ear senses. Unfortunately, aside from anti-nausea medication, the only remedy appears to be waiting until the body adjusts to its new microgravity conditions. Significantly not ill, however, was Ken Mattingly, a fact Fred Hayes poked fun at in this memorable exchange. Fred Hayes: "Say Vance." Vance Brands: "Roger, go ahead." Fred Hayes: "Are the flowers blooming yet?" Vance Brands: "Gee, I sure haven't seen any." The original flight plan called for the crew to enter and power up the lunar module Aquarius 58 hours into the mission. However, when they awoke from their scheduled rest period on the 3rd day, they were informed by Mission Control that this task had been moved up 3 hours. Then, at 9:13 p.m. on April the 12th, 55 hours after liftoff, the crew of Apollo 13 began their live color television broadcast, showing audiences back on Earth around the cramped confines of Odyssey and Aquarius, and pointing out various pieces of equipment, including Lovell and Hayes' lunar spacesuits and the crew's food preparation utensils and sleeping arrangements. To prevent the astronauts from floating around the spacecraft and bumping into things, they slept in beta-cloth sleeping bags strung hammock-style across the command module cabin. As depicted in the film, waning public interest in space exploration meant that none of the major television networks chose to cover the mission, forcing the astronauts' families to visit the VIP room at Mission Control to watch the broadcast. In the film, Jack Swigert sheepishly admits that he'd forgotten to file his federal income tax and asks for an extension. This actually happens, though not during the television broadcast as depicted in the film, but rather on the morning briefing on the second day. Furthermore, Swigert did not require a special intervention from President Richard Nixon, for under US law, citizens abroad are automatically granted a 60-day extension for filing their income taxes. And speaking of implausible things that actually happened, the scene in the film where Jim Lovell's wife Marilyn ominously loses her wedding ring in the shower drain might seem like pure Hollywood melodrama, and indeed director Ron Howard has stated that he's heard backlash on that scene seeming so contrived. However, according to the real Marilyn Lovell, this too actually happened as depicted, which is how it ended up in the film. At 55 hours and 46 minutes into the mission, the crew of Apollo 13 ended their broadcast and returned to their regular duties. Fred Haise was in Aquarius, shutting down the LEM systems after testing them. Jim Lovell was in Odyssey's lower equipment bay, gathering up the wiring from the TV camera, while Jack Swigert was sitting in the command module's left-hand seat. Back in Houston, Capcom, Jack Loosmer relayed to Swigert a number of minor housekeeping tasks, instructing him to roll the spacecraft so the crew could photograph the comet Bennett, check the CSM's maneuvering thrusters, terminate the charging of the command module battery, reconfigure the high-gain antenna, and stir the oxygen tanks. In the cylindrical service module, 300 kilograms of oxygen was stored in a pair of spherical tanks, mounted in a pie-slice-shaped equipment bay called Sector 4. These tanks not only fed the Environmental Control System, or ECS, which supplied breathing oxygen to the astronauts, but also the 3 fuel cells of the Electrical Power System, or EPS, in which oxygen was combined with hydrogen to generate electricity. 26 kilos of hydrogen were also stored in Sector 4 in 2 cylindrical 13-kilogram tanks. Both reactants were stored in a supercritical state, that is, at a combination of temperature and pressure at which they become homogeneous fluids, neither gases nor liquids. In the case of the oxygen tanks, nominal operating conditions were minus 182 degrees Celsius and 6.8 megapascals. This prevented the oxygen and hydrogen from separating into blobs of liquid floating in gas, allowing for more reliable feeding. The contents of each tank at any given moment were measured by a capacitance gauge, which applied a mild voltage across a set of concentric metal tubes. However, to achieve accurate readings, the reactant in the tank had to be of uniform density. Though the tanks were heavily insulated, over time heat would gradually seep in, causing the reactants to thermally stratify into spherical layers of varying density. The tanks were thus fitted with a pair of electrical resistance heaters and stirring fans to homogenize their contents. Throughout the Apollo 13 mission, the pressure gauge in oxygen tank number 2 appeared to be malfunctioning, prompting Seymour Liebergott, the Electrical, Environmental and Consumables Manager, or ECOM, to request a tank stir in the hopes of resolving the problem. Jack Swigert duly complied with the request, flipping on the switches to activate the stirring fans for a few seconds. But this seemingly innocuous task soon proved anything but, when 55 hours, 54 minutes, and 53 seconds into the mission, the astronauts heard a dull bang somewhere in the spacecraft. While the film depicts this as a particularly violent event, a technical debrief conducted after the mission paints a less dramatic picture. Jim Lovell: to the best of my knowledge, Jack, you were in the left-hand seat. Jack Swigert: I was in the left-hand seat. Lovell: I was in the lower equipment bay, and Fred was somewhere up in the LEM. We all heard the explosion together. There was a dull but definite bang. Not much of a vibration, though. I didn't think there was much vibration. Just a noise. Swigert: just a noise. Lovell: probably came through the structure. Haise: I felt just a slight shudder. Lovell: maybe I was floating at the time. I didn't feel it. Furthermore, while the film depicts the explosion as occurring immediately after Swigert cycled the tank stir switch, in reality it happens 90 seconds later. However, when it happens, in both film and reality, all hell immediately broke loose as master alarms blared, control panels lit up like Christmas trees, and the spacecraft lurched out of alignment, the maneuvering thruster cords firing wildly as the automatic guidance system fought to bring it back under control. In the lunar module, Fred Haise watched in alarm as the tunnel connecting Aquarius to Odyssey began to flex. Fearing that Aquarius had been hit by a meteorite, or that the 2 spacecraft might tear apart and depressurize, Haise quickly secured the cover over Aquarius's hatch to isolate the 2 cabins. Meanwhile, power levels fluctuated wildly, while the spacecraft's wild motion threw the high-gain S-band communications antenna out of alignment. Communication with Earth was lost for 1.8 seconds until the antenna automatically switched from narrow to wideband mode. 26 seconds after the event, Jack Swigert radioed Mission Control with the fateful words,
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
1 minute later, Jim Lovell repeated Swigert's message.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main beam bus on a volt.
Interestingly, the film depicts the explosion taking place around 57 hours into the flight, a full hour later than in real life. Also, in a bid to absolve Jack Swigert of responsibility for the accident, the fictionalized Jim Lovell states that if I'm in the left-hand seat, when the call comes up, I stir the tanks. In reality, the cry tank switches and gauges were located between the center and right-hand crew couches, where they could be reached by the lunar module pilot, who acted as CSM flight engineer. All over Odyssey's control panels, caution lights indicated that the main computer had restarted, while instruments associated with dozens of systems, including the oxygen tanks and propulsion system helium tanks, displayed red and white striped barber pole flags indicating trouble. Back at Mission Control, the flight controller's screens began filling up with garbled data. Hoping the trouble was simply an instrumentation error, ECOM Cy Leibgott instructed the astronauts to reset all the systems and instruments. Unfortunately, this had no effect. After 10 minutes of frantic back and forth, Flight Director Gene Kranz tried to bring the situation back under control by asking, can we review our status here, Cy, and see what we've got from a standpoint of status? What do you think we've got in the spacecraft that's good? Unfortunately, the answer was very little. Fuel cells 1 and 3 were reading 0 output, while fuel cell 2 was putting out 53 amps and falling. Meanwhile, the oxygen pressure in tank 2 was reading 0, while that in tank 2 was falling fast. Working the problem, Leibgott suggested temporarily taking the fuel cells offline before reconnecting them in the hopes of resetting the EPS to nominal conditions, the NASA equivalents of have you tried unplugging it and plugging it back in again. But once again, this failed to correct the problem, and then Jim Lovell dropped this bombshell. That's AC, okay? And that's good with AC, and it looks good to me. Looking out the hatch, we're venting something. We're venting something out into space. It's a gas of some sort. Now, it's worth pointing here the almost surreal calmness with which this sphincter tightening observation was made. Indeed, while the film Apollo 13 depicts the astronauts panicking and bickering with one another, in reality, all three remained largely calm and collected throughout the crisis, only occasionally succumbing to frustration and exhaustion. These were, after all, experienced test pilots used to having their lives on the line, and in the end partially chosen for their ability to keep their heads when the hits the fan. Had they been unable to remain calm under pressure, they would have never been selected as astronauts. The film depicts Jack Swigert being treated with suspicion and contempt by Lovell and Hayes, but this too is fiction added for the sake of drama. Calm demeanors notwithstanding, it was clear that something was very wrong with the spacecraft. As the seconds ticked by, it dawned on everyone that the gas level reported venting from the CSM was likely Odyssey's rapidly dwindling supply of oxygen. But with so many problems piling on top of one another, it was difficult to know what to tackle first. For instance, the explosion and the thrust from the venting gas was causing the spacecraft to tumble wildly, bringing the guidance system to the edge of what is known as gimbal lock. As previously mentioned, the IMU was based on a set of gyroscopes mounted in a set of 3 nested rotating gimbals, each providing a separate degree of freedom. If the spacecraft tumbled too far out of its regular attitude, 2 of the gimbals could become aligned and locked together, reducing the gyroscope's degrees of freedom from 3 to 2 and crippling the guidance system. Furthermore, ever since the explosion, the onboard computer had been frantically firing the Reaction Control System, or RCS, thruster quads in an attempt to get the spacecraft under control, expending huge amounts of precious fuel. Due to the spacecraft's erratic movements, ECOM instructed the astronauts to switch RCS thruster control over to the still-functioning B electrical bus. Meanwhile, the oxygen supply continued to bleed away, and the power from fuel cell 2 to drop. Once again, Gene Kranz attempted to wrestle the situation back under control. Okay now, let's everybody keep cool. We've got the LEM still attached. The LEM spacecraft's good, so if we need it to get back home, we've got a LEM to do a good portion of it with. Okay, let's make sure that we don't do anything that's going to blow our CSM electrical power with the batteries, or that will cause us to lose the main or the fuel cell number 2. Okay, we want to keep the O2 and that kind of stuff working. We'd like to have RCS, but we've got the command module system, so we're in good shape if we need to get home. Let's solve the problem, but let's not make it any worse by guessing. Now by this time, the econ team was beginning to suspect that the purge valves in the fuel cells had accidentally opened, allowing the oxygen to vent into space. Whatever the case, it was clear that Odyssey would soon be out of power. The The command module had 3 onboard batteries, designated A, B, and C, to power onboard systems after separation from the service module. The astronauts thus connected Battery A to Electrical Bus A to supplement the flagging power output from Fuel Cell 2, but this was only a short-term solution. The CM batteries had to be conserved for use during re-entry and could not be recharged if the fuel cells could not be restored. ECOM thus instructed the astronauts to power down as many non-vital systems as possible in order to get their current draw below 10 amps and conserve what little power remained in the one working fuel cell. Swiget and Lovell thus pulled out the flight data file and began the laborious process of going through the power down checklist. Meanwhile, Fred Hayes, suspecting that the spacecraft's erratic movements were being caused by thrusters firing on their own, took manual control of the spacecraft in order to stabilize it. Unfortunately, his attempts were unsuccessful, and the ship continued to tumble. By this time, the guidance officer, or Guido, was able to confirm that the venting gas had indeed blown Apollo 13 off its regular trajectory. At the same time, members of the relief control team, as well as fellow astronauts, began arriving at mission control, offering to help in any way they could. Director of Flight Operations Christopher Kraft was in the shower when he heard about the disaster and raced, still soaking wet, to mission control, where Gene Kranz bluntly informed him, "We're in deep..." Meanwhile, astronaut office bosses Deke Slayton and Alan Shepard were in their offices when they heard the commotion over the open squawk box communication circuit and came rushing to mission control to investigate. All the while, the astronauts continued to shut down systems in the command module and cycle the fuel cells in an attempt to bring them back online. But no matter what they tried, cells 1 and 3 failed to respond while the power output of cell 2 continued to drop. Mission control was forced to face the sobering reality: Odyssey was dying. Ecom Liebergott thus instructed the astronauts to disconnect Battery A to preserve its remaining charge and to isolate the 2 independent oxygen systems aboard the command module. The surge tank was a small 1.7 kilogram reservoir, which both helped absorb volume fluctuations in the service module's oxygen tanks and supplied the astronauts with oxygen during re-entry. As the service module tanks continued to leak oxygen, the EPS and ECS began drawing from the surge tank to keep oxygen flowing. Isolating the system thus prevented this vital oxygen supply from being lost. The repress package, meanwhile, was a small oxygen supply used to repressurize the command module cabin in an emergency. It could also supply oxygen to emergency breathing masks in case the cabin air became contaminated. Throughout this period, ECOM attempted to feed the CSM's rapidly dwindling power into the oxygen tank heaters, hoping to increase the tank pressure and restore the flow of oxygen into the EPS. But the pressure still continued to fall. At 56 hours, 48 minutes into the mission, 55 minutes after the crew first heard the fateful bang, Cy Liebergott made the pronouncement everyone had been dreading. Flight, we're going to hit 100 psi in an hour and 54 minutes. That's the end right there. In other words, in less than 2 hours, Odyssey would be dead in the water. In one final long shot, Liebergott instructed the astronauts to check and reset the circuit breakers controlling the fuel cell and cryogenic tank systems, hoping this would restore tank pressure and cell operation. But once again, this plan was unsuccessful. At the same time, Swiget reported that the cloud of gas and debris around the spacecraft had begun to dissipate, an observation that matched the rapidly falling oxygen tank pressure. Indeed, by now the cloud of vented oxygen surrounding the spacecraft was so large that it could easily be seen by amateur astronomers on Earth. As Liebergott and the astronauts struggled to get a grip on the power and oxygen situation, Flight Director Gene Kranz began to consider how to get the crew home should the worst come to pass. There were 2 main abort modes for Apollo missions. In a direct abort, the astronauts turned around and fired their engines, cancelling their forward velocity so that they began falling back towards the Earth. This maneuver required the spacecraft to still be within the Earth's zone of influence before the moon's gravitational pull began to dominate. This window would run out around 61 hours into the flight, or about 6 hours after the explosion. However, direct abort required the use of the Service Module Propulsion System, or SPS. Given the baffling readings coming from the service module systems, Mission Control deemed this maneuver inadvisable. After all, if the SPS was damaged, it could explode the moment it was switched on. Furthermore, the direct abort procedure required the lunar module to be jettisoned in order to allow the CSM to gain sufficient velocity, something that was now impossible. The only option then was to place the spacecraft on a free return trajectory, swinging around the moon and back to Earth. With the SPS out of commission, the necessary course correction burns would have to be performed using the Lunar Module Descent Propulsion System, or DPS. While the film depicts the use of the DPS as an unprecedented last-minute improvisation, such a contingency had in fact been foreseen from the very beginning of the Apollo program, and detailed procedures have been written into Apollo 13's flight plan. What nobody had accounted for, however, was a situation in which the CSM was no longer capable of keeping the crew alive. 57 minutes after the accident, Cy Liebergott made one last desperate attempt to cut off the leak and save what little oxygen remained aboard Odyssey. Theorizing that the oxygen was leaking from a damaged line in fuel cell 3, Liebergott suggested closing the reactant valves to that cell. This was a fateful decision, for once those valves were closed, they could not be reopened. And mission rules stated that if any one of the 3 fuels was shut down, the lunar landing mission had to be aborted. The astronauts' reaction to Liebergott's instructions was understandably stunned. Jack Loosma. Okay, 13, this is Houston. It appears to us that we're losing O2 flow through fuel cell 3, so we want you to close the react valve on fuel cell 3. It looks like fuel cell 1 and 2 are trying to hold up okay. You copy? Fred Hayes. Are you saying fuel cell 1 and 2? 1 and 2 are trying to hold up, but we're leaking O2 out of fuel cell 3, and you want me to shut the react valve on fuel cell 3? Did I hear you right? Jack Loosma. That's affirmative. Close the react valve on fuel cell 3. Hayes. Okay, I'll go to the SSR page. Do you want me to go through the whole smash for the fuel cell shutdown? Is that correct? The astronauts duly closed the valves, fully aware of what it meant. They had just lost the moon. But if they hoped they would at least be able to save their crippled spacecraft, they were gravely disappointed. The oxygen levels in Tank 2 continued to fall. The crew next tried shutting down the reactants to fuel cell 1. Still nothing. There was nothing to be done. Odyssey was dying. At that moment, 57 hours and 6 minutes into the mission control underwent a shift change, with Green Kranz's white team being relieved by Glyn Lunny's black team. But white team did not simply go home to rest. Soon they would be hard at work, pouring through Apollo 13's telemetry data, trying to figure out what went wrong. But it would fall to Lunny to make one of the most fateful decisions of the mission. 1 hour and 12 minutes after the crisis had begun, he instructed the astronauts to power down Odyssey and retreat into Aquarius. The lunar module had just become a lifeboat. Just like the use of the DPS engines for course correction, however, the idea of using the LEM in this fashion was not as unprecedented as the film makes it out to be. NASA had previously drawn up contingency plans in case the SPS engine and other systems aboard the service module failed. In such a scenario, the plan was to jettison the service module and have the crew shelter in the lunar module for the return flight to Earth. Another plan called for a stranded lunar module ascent stage to be powered down after reaching lunar orbit, allowing the 2 astronauts aboard to survive until the command module pilot in the CSM could rendezvous with and rescue them. However, all these plans assumed that the astronauts were already in lunar orbit, a milestone Apollo 13 was still 24 hours away from reaching. Worse still, powering up the LEM was not a simple matter of throwing a few switches. By the book, the full startup procedure for the LEM took several hours and required power supplied by the CSM through a docking tunnel umbilical. But by the time Flight Director Gene Lunny ordered the evacuation, Black Team Ecom Clint Burton estimated that Odyssey had only 18 minutes of power left. Burton thus drew up a hack that allowed the LEM to power up using its own internal batteries, which was duly transmitted to Fred Hayes. Meanwhile, Jim Lovell connected Fuel Cell 2 to the command module's Battery A, hoping to store up as much power as possible before the cell went completely dead, while Jack Swigert began powering down the CSM itself. The goal was to leave the command module in a state where it could be powered up with sufficient power and other consumables to make a successful re-entry and splashdown. However, Swigert could not simply power down the spacecraft all at once. The astronauts needed to transfer the data from the CSM's pings into the equivalent system on the LEM, so the latter's platform would not need to be realigned from scratch. He thus had to leave this system powered on until the very last minute. As the other 2 astronauts began powering up Aquarius, Hayes grimly quipped, "Didn't think I'd be back in here so soon." To save time and battery power, Hayes and Lovell skipped many steps in the regular power-up procedure, such as switching on the cabin heaters and the VHF radio normally used for short-range communication between the CSM and LEM. Then, once all the vital systems were powered up, they began entering the navigation data from the CSM computer into the LEM using the display keyboard or disk key. This procedure required Jack Swigert in the CSM to manually keep the whole spacecraft stack in stable alignment, otherwise the entered attitude values would be inaccurate and would have to be refined later. This was no easy task, given the ongoing venting from the various gas tanks in the service module that kept pushing the spacecraft out of alignment. Equally challenging was Lovell and Hayes' task of converting the gimbal angles from the CSM IMU into the different coordinate system of the LEM. As depicted in the film, these conversions were already done manually on specially prepared paper worksheets, and Jim Lovell, understandably frazzled by the extremely stressful situation, really did ask the engineers at Mission Control to check his arithmetic. However, the subsequent scene of said engineers frantically working their slide rules is entirely fictitious, for slide rules are used for multiplication and division, not simple addition and subtraction. While the astronauts were frantically working to complete the changeover from Odyssey to Aquarius, Ecom Clint Burton made a grim announcement. Fuel Cell 2 had reached the end of the line. Swigert thus quickly switched over to Battery A so the spacecraft would not suddenly lose power. He then carried out a procedure as momentous and unprecedented as closing off the fuel cell reactant valves, shutting down the heaters for the IMU. This had never been done before, and all involved wondered whether this delicate instrument could survive for 3 days in the cold of outer space and still be reactivated when needed. There was some evidence that it could. According to Apollo programmer Don Arles, during its development at MIT, a prototype IMU was left in a car trunk overnight during the winter, but worked perfectly when thawed. However, Mission Control was likely unaware of this fact, and their decision to shut down the heaters was, in the words of flight director Glyn Lunny, academic. If they didn't, by the time Apollo 13 reached Earth, Odyssey would have insufficient power to make a successful re-entry.
Once the navigation data was transferred over, Lovell and Hayes faced another pressing task, activating Aquarius' cooling system, essential to keeping the LEM's electronics working properly. This system was based on the circulation of water, which absorbed heat from the electronic modules before dumping it overboard via a device called a sublimator. This consisted of a metal plate covered in thousands of microscopic holes, one side of which was exposed to the vacuum of space. Water fed into the other side of the plate would percolate through these holes, evaporate, and freeze into a thin sheet of ice, which then turned directly into vapor via a process known as sublimation. Warm cooling water from the electronic systems was passed through separate channels in the sublimator plate, where the waste heat was transferred to the ice and out to space. A similar system was used in portable life support systems, or PLS backpacks, worn by the astronauts on the moon, connected to the liquid cooling garment, or LCG, worn under the spacesuits. One critical aspect of the Apollo 13 mission entirely omitted from the film is just how crucial the astronauts' water supply was to their survival. In the film, the characters note that the LEM was only designed to support 2 astronauts for 2 days on the moon, and they wonder whether it can support 3 astronauts for the 3-day return journey to Earth. In reality, the LEM had plentiful oxygen reserves, as the astronauts were expected to depressurize and repressurize the cabin multiple times when performing EVAs on the lunar surface. Cooling water, however, was in much shorter supply, as if it ran out, the vital electronic systems the astronauts relied on to get home might begin to overheat and fail. Interestingly, the ability of the LEM's electronics to function without cooling was tested during the Apollo 11 mission. After transferring over to CSM Columbia, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin jettisoned the ascent stage of the LEM Eagle with its systems still running, but its cooling system turned off. To their surprise, the spacecraft continued to function and transmit telemetry for another 8 hours. This could potentially give the Apollo 13 astronauts a useful buffer should their water run out near the end of the mission, but for now, Mission Control wasn't willing to take any chances, and the management of cooling water would become a top priority throughout the rest of the flight. It's also worth noting that the constant flow of vapor from the sublimator plate generated a small but measurable amount of thrust. This was insignificant to normal operations around the moon, but would later prove very important as the astronauts began their long coast back towards the Earth. In addition to the cooling system, Fred Hayes powered on Aquarius' atmospheric rejuvenation system, or ARS, starting oxygen flowing out of the valves normally used to supply the astronaut spacesuits. At this point, some of you might be wondering why the astronauts were in such a hurry to power up the LEM. After all, both spacecraft were filled with oxygen. Surely the astronauts could have kept working for hours, even with the spacecraft powered down, right? Well, no, actually, thanks to an unusual property of microgravity. On Earth, exhaled carbon dioxide, being denser than air, falls away from the breather's mouth and sinks to the ground. In the absence of gravity, however, it just accumulates around the breather's head, meaning that without fans to circulate air around the spacecraft cabin, an astronaut would quickly suffocate in a cloud of their own exhalations. Indeed, as the power in Odyssey began to fail, Jim Lovell connected a spacesuit supply hose to one of the LEM's supply valves and fed the other end into the command module, giving Jack Swigert more oxygen and time to complete the power-down procedures. Well, by this point, the LEM's guidance system had been powered up and aligned. The reaction control systems, or RCS thrust quads, had yet to be powered up. However, the RCS system on Odyssey had been powered down 5 minutes before, leaving the spacecraft without any active control. Swigert was thus forced to reactivate Odyssey's thrusters and keep the spacecraft aligned until Aquarius could be fully powered up, wasting more power from the precious re-entry batteries. It was, as flight director Glyn Lunny recalled, a low point in morale when the flight controllers realized this blunder. Finally, however, 58 hours and 40 minutes into the mission, 2 hours and 45 minutes after the explosion, Jim Lovell announced that Odyssey had been completely powered down. Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert retreated into the cramped lunar module, which would become their home for the next 3 days. But while the astronauts had successfully cleared one major hurdle, there were many more challenges to come. As Flight Director Glenn Lundy laid out to his flight controllers, "Okay, everybody, look. We got a number of long-range problems right now. We have the bird to do, which is at about 79 hours, 28 hours from now, and that's one business. We have to get the track up as we needed to take care of that burn. Hopefully, we won't need to do much with that, although I don't know how many amps that's going to take. However, right now, I want to be sure that we get the whole situation stabilized with the LEM and the CSM. We've got to start bringing the LEM power down some and get any non-required stuff off the line so we don't use up those amp hours that we don't need to give away. And I want you to pay attention to the configuration we're currently in and get the people offline working on the longer range problems, especially the lifeboat problems now associated with the LEM. You know, LIO, etc. Let's get that all configured. But right now, I want you to concentrate on keeping this thing. But right now, I want the guys that are in the room to concentrate on keeping this thing right now going along all right and watching it. All right? The top priority at this time was preparing for the upcoming course correction burn, which will place the astronauts on a free return trajectory toward the Earth. As previously mentioned, Apollo 13 was using a hybrid free return trajectory to allow it to land at a more northerly latitude. If the second correction burn were not correctly performed, then the spacecraft would miss the Earth by thousands of kilometers. This burn would take place at PC +2, that is, 2 hours after the spacecraft passed the Pericynthian, its closest approach to the Moon, 79 hours and 25 minutes into the mission. This would bring the astronauts home 133 hours after launch. However, it would also bring them down in a backup recovery zone in the South Atlantic rather than their prime zone in the South Pacific. While less than ideal due to a relative lack of recovery forces in the area, this was the best that could be accomplished with a single correction burn. If circumstances allowed, further burns could be performed later to bring the astronauts down sooner and in the primary recovery area. Fearing that communications could be lost at any moment, Mission Control scrambled to transmit the burn details to the astronauts in the form of pre-advisory data, or PAD. But for the burn to be successfully performed, the astronauts had to complete the fine alignment of the LEM's IMU. As soon as the crisis began, NASA powered up the CSM and LEM simulators at the Manned Spacecraft Center and dispatched a team of astronauts and engineers to work out all the emergency procedures the crew of Apollo 13 would need to perform, such as quickly powering up the LEM and aligning its guidance system. While the film shows nearly all the simulator work being performed by Prime Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly, in reality a large number of people contributed to these efforts, most notably astronaut training director Riley McCafferty and fellow Apollo astronauts Charlie Duke, Alan Shepard, Dick Gordon, Gene Cernan, Ronald Evans, Joe Engel, and David Scott. Scott would later serve as the primary consultant for the film Apollo 13. Unfortunately, when Mission Control asked what stars they could see to align the IMU, the crew discovered a major problem that would plague them throughout the mission. The explosion had created a large cloud of debris, which, due to the lack of air resistance, was still traveling along with the spacecraft, creating a field of hundreds of false stars that made it nearly impossible to get a reliable celestial fix. While astronauts grapple with this problem, a panel of NASA officials, including Deputy Director Christopher C. Kraft Jr., Apollo Spacecraft Program Office Manager and former Gemini 4 and Apollo 9 astronaut James A. McDivitt, and Director of Flight Operations Sigurd Scheuberg, assembled for a press conference at the Houston News Center. As depicted in the film, by 1970, the American public had so little interest in the Apollo program that all the major TV networks declined to carry the astronauts' live broadcast. However, following the accident, all eyes were suddenly on NASA and the imperiled astronauts. When pressed by reporters, the managers assured the American people that the spacecraft had more than enough consumables to get the astronauts all the way home, though Chris Kraft admitted that, quote, "This is as serious situation as we've ever had in manned spaceflight." Ironically, just 2 hours before the explosion, the mission had been running so smoothly that Capcom Joe Kerwin stated, "We're bored to tears down here." Thus, contrary to popular belief, the entire catastrophe appears to have been Kerwin's fault, via jinxing the mission. Meanwhile, the astronauts were trying to stay on top of an ever-mounting list of problems, such as a small leak in one of the LEM's oxygen tanks caused by a faulty O-ring seal, and excessive power consumption, which forced Fred Hayes to shut down most of the LEM's data displays. And as if this wasn't bad enough, the LEM's communication system began receiving radio interference from an unexpected source, the spent S-4B upper stage of the Saturn V booster. The top of this stage held a system called the Instrument Unit, or IU, used to control the entire booster at liftoff, which, by an unfortunate coincidence, systems happen to communicate with the Earth at the same frequency as the LEM. Ordinarily, this was not a problem as the S4B was expected to impact the moon before the LEM was powered up. Thankfully, the engineers at the Honeysuckle Creek Tracking Station in Australia soon came up with a fix using their large narrow beam antenna to detune the LEM's unified S-band antenna and pull its operating frequency away from that of the S4B. This procedure was only needed until the spent stage impacted the moon's surface 20 hours later. All the while, the gas venting from the service module continued to throw the spacecraft out of alignment, making the already poor communication situation even more precarious. This endless parade of problems soon caused the astronauts to lose their normal steely cool, leading to the amusing exchange, "Fred Hayes, watch the crapping attitude. Jim Lovell, we're okay. Hayes, goddamn, I wish you'd get to something I know. Lovell, well, as soon as we get over there, we'll stop it with the TTCA. Hayes, okay. Jack Luzma. And Aquarius, Houston, we've got you both on Vox. Vox in this case refers to a voice-activated microphone, meaning the mission control and by extension the general public could hear the astronauts cursing. To maintain some semblance of privacy, the astronauts often used the push-to-talk function on the microphone or recorded comments into an onboard tape recorder for later transcription. However, on Apollo 13, the latter device was switched off to save power, so no colourful private conversations from the post-accident period survive. Among the many plates the astronauts were trying to keep spinning at this time was a problem of water. As the drinking water stored in the powered-down command module would soon freeze solid, the astronauts attempted to siphon out as much as possible using any sealed container they could find. There was also the problem of a more unpleasant liquid, urine. As covered in our previous video, the incredible and hilarious engineering of answering nature's call in space, Apollo astronauts relieved themselves using the urine collection system, which consisted of a condom-like roll-on sleeve connected to a vacuum hose that sucked urine into an onboard tank, which was then vented into space. However, this procedure required the use of an electric pump, so to save power, the astronauts attempted to vent their urine passively through a vent in the command module hatch. Unfortunately, this caused urine to spray and freeze over the hatch window, making it impossible to use for navigation. The astronauts thus abandoned this plan and simply stored their urine in bags for the rest of the mission. As Lovell later recounted, we had urine all over the place, stacked in places we never even thought about. The nice thing about it, though, is that we found enough quick disconnects and rigged up lines to get urine into things that we were normally putting other stuff into or taking stuff out of. So it worked out that we could store a lot more urine than we thought we could, which is lovely. At the same time, the astronauts were trying to solve the problem of aligning the IMU despite the cloud of debris surrounding the spacecraft. Backup Commander John Young suggested reorienting the spacecraft to block the glare of the sun with the CSM, allowing the sun to be seen, a procedure that it used on the Apollo 10 mission. If this did not work, the astronauts planned to try alternative sighting methods, such as using the much larger and brighter Sun, Moon, or Earth as alignment references. In the film, this is depicted as a seat-of-the-pants procedure, improvised by Jim Lovell at the last minute. But in reality, as is a theme you're probably picking up here, these contingencies had been worked out long in advance. However, being significantly larger than the stars, these objects could potentially yield less accurate alignments. At 60 hours and 22 minutes into the flight, Capcom Jack Luzma transmitted a new pad to the crew, instructing them to perform a short burn at 61 hours to place them on a free return trajectory to land in the Indian Ocean at 151 hours and 45 minutes. While this was considerably longer flight time than in the original trajectory, it at least guaranteed that the astronauts would get home with minimum engine burn. Once around the moon, the astronauts could then perform the PC+2 burn to significantly speed up their return. This latter procedure would prove vital, for at current consumption rates, Mission Control estimated that the LEM had only 31 hours of cooling water left. Unfortunately, the astronauts were still having trouble spotting stars with which to align the IMU, so they asked for the burn to be pushed back by half an hour. Mission Control agreed, but no matter what the astronauts tried, the reflective surface of the CSM fuselage, LM thruster quads, and the surrounding debris made it impossible to see any stars. Furthermore, they were having difficulty controlling the orientation of the spacecraft. Originally, axial rotation was accomplished by firing opposite pairs of thrusters, but this assumed that the thrusters were located close to the spacecraft's center of mass. Now, however, the LEM was attached to the 29-ton dead weight of the CSM, meaning simple roll, pitch, and yaw maneuvers produced significant translation, potentially affecting the spacecraft's trajectory. This was particularly problematic given that the planned free return trajectory called for Apollo 13 to swing around the moon at an altitude of only 110 kilometers. Unable to solve the problem in time, the crew decided to make do with the coarse IMU alignment that they already had and began preparing for the burn. Here, Fred Hayes' intimate knowledge of the LEM and its systems proved invaluable, as he suggested they shut off the spacecraft's abort system. This prevented the system from accidentally triggering an abort and separating the ascent and descent stages, which would rob the crew of the consumables they needed to get home. At 61 hours and 31 minutes into the mission, the crew performed the 31-second burn. Now, even if they did nothing more, they were guaranteed to return to Earth. Whether their consumables, especially the vital cooling water, would last all the way home would remain to be seen. By this time, both the astronauts and the engineers in Mission Control had been working flat out for more than 6 hours under impossibly stressful conditions, prompting Deputy Public Affairs Officer, or PAO, Chuck Hollingshead to quip, "Here in Mission Control, the coffee cup has become an appliance second only to the headset in usefulness." As a result, Mission Control advised the astronauts to get some rest as they approached the moon. Originally, the plan called for 2 astronauts to sleep, while one remained awake to monitor the spacecraft systems and communicate with Mission Control. However, this quickly proved unworkable, as nobody could be expected to sleep with Mission Control and the astronaut on watch constantly speaking to one another. Instead, it was decided to let all 3 astronauts sleep at the same time, while Mission Control monitored the spacecraft systems, ready to wake the crew should any problems crop up. This remained the standard procedure throughout the rest of the Apollo program. After a brief rest period, the astronauts began preparing for the upcoming PC+2 burn, scheduled for 79 hours and 25 minutes into the mission. At 76 hours, 42 minutes, Apollo 13 passed into the shadow of the moon, cutting out the glare of the sun and allowing the stars to be seen clearly through the following cloud of debris. Finally, Jim Lovell was able to perform the fine alignment of the IMU using the stars Scorpio and Antares, and he began powering up the LEMS Aboard Guidance System, or AGS, a backup computer and IMU designed for use if the astronauts had to abort a lunar landing and separate the LEM ascent stage from its descent stage. Mission Control had determined that the LEM's primary guidance system consumed too much power and cooling water, so the less power-intensive AGS was used instead. And as a fascinating aside, among the designers of the AGS was Space Technology Laboratories engineer Judith Love Cohen, mother of actor and musician Jack Black. At 77 hours, 8 minutes into the mission, radio contact was lost as Apollo 13 disappeared around the far side of the moon. On a normal mission, this period would have been a tense one, as Mission Control waited to learn if the spacecraft had successfully entered lunar orbit. But as Apollo 13 was simply slingshotting around the moon, they only had to wait the 25 minutes it would take for them to reappear on the other side. Only later would the astronauts learn that their trajectory had carried them farther away from the Earth than any previous manned mission, a spaceflight record which has yet to be beaten. The chance to observe the rarely seen far side of the moon proved irresistible to the 2 rookie astronauts, as Jim Lovell later recalled. "Suddenly I noticed that Swigert and Hayes had their cameras out and were busy photographing the lunar surface. I looked at them incredulously and said, 'If we don't make this next maneuver correctly, you won't get your pictures developed.' They said, 'Well, you've been here before, and we haven't.'" Actually, some of the pictures these tourists took turned out to be very useful. He was, of course, referring to his previous flight to the moon in December 1968 aboard Apollo 8, while many of the images captured by Apollo 13 did indeed prove useful, especially those of the rarely photographed crater Soslovsky. This exercise proved difficult due to the increasing amounts of condensation gathering on the spacecraft's windows. While the windows were equipped with electric heaters to avoid this, the astronauts dared not turn them on for fear of wasting precious electrical power. Indeed, each of the heaters consumed as much power as the entire guidance computer. Right on schedule, Apollo 13 emerged from the far side of the moon and re-established radio contact with Mission Control, whereupon Capcom Vance Brands informed them that the S4B stage had successfully impacted the lunar surface, the impacts being clearly picked up by the seismometer left by Apollo 12. At this news, Lovell dryly quipped, "Well, at least something worked on this flight." Now on their way home, the crew of Apollo 13 prepared to make the PC+2 burn that would shave 10 hours from their return time, bringing them down in the Mid-Pacific Landing Site, or MPL, in 63.5 hours, or 143 hours from launch. At this point, it's worth addressing a key question. Given that the service module was, by this time, simply useless dead weight, why did the astronauts simply not jettison it, making the whole spacecraft considerably lighter and allowing them to accelerate faster and get home even sooner? Well, there are 2 main reasons. First, given the rather precarious state of Apollo 13's guidance and control system, making such a high delta-V burn risked incurring significant errors which would require later burns to correct. This, in turn, risked using up the limited propellant available aboard the LEM. Secondly, jettisoning the SM would expose the heat shield to the bottom of the command module, vital for surviving the extreme heat of orbital re-entry. Knowing that there was a chance the heat shield had already been damaged by the explosion, NASA did not wish to further expose it to thermal or micrometeorite damage during the long coast back to Earth. For these reasons, it was deemed safer to proceed with the service module still attached. Another interesting tidbit worth mentioning is why the Mid-Pacific Landing Site was preferred over all the others. Not only was a large recovery fleet already in place, including the aircraft carrier USS Iwo Jima, but this site allowed for the safe disposal of one of the more dangerous items aboard the Apollo spacecraft. The Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments Package, or ALSEP, the astronauts were to deploy on the lunar surface, was powered by a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, or RTG, which converted the radioactive decay heat of a capsule of plutonium plutonium-238 into electricity. This capsule was stored in a special metal and graphite cask mounted in one of the equipment bays on the lunar module's descent stage. While setting up the ALSEP, one of the astronauts had to open the cask, removing the capsule, and insert it into the RTG using a set of special tools. This was done in case a launch had to be aborted, with the cask being designed to survive the heat of re-entry and prevent plutonium from being scattered through the atmosphere. Landing at the MPL would allow Apollo 13's usage fuel cask to land in the Tonga Trench. At nearly 11 kilometers deep, it's one of the lowest points on the Earth's surface. The pad for the PC+2 burn called for the astronauts to align the spacecraft using the stars Deneb and Vega, but as Apollo 13 was now out of the moon's shadow, the lingering cloud of debris made this impossible. Mission Control thus instructed the crew to sight the sun, Earth, and features on the moon through the spacecraft windows in order to check their attitude. While performing this task, Jim Lovell reported spotting Mount Marilyn, a triangular feature east of the crater Secchi he had named after his wife during the Apollo 8 mission. With the spacecraft's attitude confirmed at 79 hours and 28 minutes into the flight, the crew commenced the burn, burning the DPS engine for 4 minutes. It's worth noting here that due to the corrosive nature of the hypergolic propellant and the fact that the nozzle was cooled by ablation, literally the lining being corroded away by the exhaust plume, neither the descent stage nor ascent stage engines were test-fired prior to installation aboard the LEM, meaning that the first time it was ever fired was during the mission itself. It is a testament to the incredible engineering and quality control that went into the Apollo program that every single one of these engines performed flawlessly when called upon. Furthermore, operating the DPS at over 90% thrust for too long ran the risk of destroying the engines, so throughout their unorthodox mission, the crew of Apollo 13 were playing with fire. But in this case, all went well, and once Mission Control confirmed Apollo 13 was on the correct trajectory, Jim Lovell declared, "We're now in the hands of tracking." In the film, this line is replaced by the more poetic, "We just put Sir Isaac Newton in the driver's seat," based on a similar quip made by Lovell's Apollo 8 crewmate Bill Anders. While an additional burn would later be required to place the spacecraft into its narrow re-entry corridor, for now the astronauts were headed home as quickly as could be managed. To save power, they powered down the AGC, which would not be needed until later. But they could not simply sit back and relax, for another crisis was brewing: rising carbon dioxide levels. As previously mentioned, Aquarius had more than enough oxygen reserves to keep the 3 astronauts alive all the way back to Earth. But with every breath, Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert were filling the atmosphere of their tiny spacecraft with ever greater quantities of toxic CO2. At this time, CO2 partial pressure was measuring 6.7 millimeters of mercury. Experiments on the ground had revealed that humans could function at levels up to 22 millimeters, but beyond this, they would begin to experience the symptoms of carbon dioxide poisoning, including headaches, confusion, and fatigue. As a compromise, the flight surgeons advised an upper limit of 15 millimeters, though this was still playing with the limits of safety, and around 91.5 hours into the flight, 33 hours after the crew retreated into their lifeboat, the master CO2 alarm in the LEM lit up. Usually, CO2 gas was filtered out by the CSM's environmental control system and the LEM's atmospheric rejuvenation system using scrubber cartridges filled with CO2-absorbing lithium hydroxide. However, the cartridges aboard Aquarius were only designed to support 2 astronauts on the lunar surface for 2 days and were quickly becoming saturated. Furthermore, spares were unhelpfully stored in the Modular Equipment Storage Assembly, or MESA, in the LEM descent stage and could only be accessed from the exterior of the spacecraft. Worse still, while plenty of spare scrubber cartridges were available from the command module, due to the 2 spacecraft being designed by different contractors, North American Rockwell and Grumman, their respective ECSs took different styles of cartridges, the CSM modules being square and the LEM ones being round. As aptly noted in the film, if the astronauts were to avoid being suffocated by their own exhalations, they had to figure out the age-old problem of fitting a square peg into a round hole. Thus began one of the most famous episodes of the entire Apollo 13 saga, legendary among engineers and would-be MacGyvers everywhere. At the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, a team of engineers from NASA's Crew Systems Division was hastily assembled to figure out how to adapt the CSM cartridges to work with the LEM's life support system, using a very limited array of materials aboard the spacecraft. The superstar wizards involved included, among others, Division Chief Ed Smiley, Deputy Chief Jim Coriel, and Test Director Jim LeBlanc. As Smiley later recalled, "I think me and Jim Carroll, probably Dick, Richard E. Mayo, concluded that there was a way we could probably use the command module canisters in the LEM, and our first thought was to use the liquid-cooled garment and the tape liquid-cooled garment bag, plastic bag, and the tape to tape the command module canister on the suit outlet hose in the LEM, just blow the air through." That was what we were working towards. Somebody, I'm not sure who, suggested that it would be better to put on the suit inlet hose because you get warmer air and moisture air, which makes the chemical work better. That was a better solution. They said they would suck the bag down against the canister and block the flow, and that's when we came up with the EVA cue card from the flight plan to form an arch. So that's what we began to work toward. Jim LeBlanc later described a scene which was immortalized in the 1995 film in which, quote, our Deputy Division Chief, Jim Coriel, had our technicians set up 2 long conference room tables in Building 7 High Bay just adjacent to the 11-foot chamber. He then had us gather up samples of materials that existed within the Apollo 13 command module and LEM and set them up on the tables. These included plastic bags, duct tape, flight data files, etc. While this activity was taking place, I was assigned as the test director to perform any tests required to verify whatever reconfigured LiOH canister that his team came up with. I assembled a team experienced in operating the chamber, the support systems, as well as the LEM ECS. I prepared a test procedure to operate the LEM ECS at a 5 psia reduced pressure, exactly the same pressure as the Apollo 13 spacecraft. We already had a system in place to inject a controlled amount of CO2 into the 11-foot cabin, so we functionally checked all of our chamber and support systems as we awaited a modified LiOH canister configuration. Jim Coriel worked tirelessly and came up with the plastic bag, flight data file, and duct tape command module LiOH canisters. Each astronaut goes through a metabolic calibration on a treadmill prior to flight, so that through monitoring instrumentation installed on each crew member, the medical doctors and engineers can determine each crewman's metabolic rate and also the rate at which each new crew member expires CO2 back into the cabin. With this information, we set up our test to inject a CO2 rate equivalent to the 3 Apollo 13 crew members. We also had a real-time cabin gas analyzer that monitored the 11-foot cabin atmosphere to assess when the canister had to be changed out. Now, once the design was worked out, Capcom Advanced Brands communicated the assembly procedure step by step to the astronauts. The final adapter, referred to by the astronauts as the mailbox, or Wisconsin Dairy Farm Fix, required the astronauts to encase the CSM scrubber cartridges in a plastic bag. In this case, the bags used to store the Moonwalker's liquid cooling garments, or LCGs. One end of this bag was attached to a red spacesuit outlet hose, which was then plugged into the LEM's ARS. 2 hoses connected the Apollo astronauts' A7L spacesuits to the ARS, or their PLSS backpacks, named for the color of their anodized aluminium connectors. A blue hose for fresh oxygen, and a red hose for waste air, which was passed through CO2 and moisture scrubbers before being returned to the breathing loop. To construct their adapter, the astronauts had to cut open the beta cloth cover holding the 2 hoses together and separate out the red hose. This proved unexpectedly challenging, as for obvious reasons, the spacecraft was not plentifully supplied with sharp implements. In the end, the crew ended up using the scissors supplied for cutting open their food packages. The hose was then sealed to the plastic bag using everyone's favorite all-purpose tool, duct tape. As alluded to prevent one end of the bag from being sucked down into the cartridge inlet, blocking the flow of air, the astronauts were instructed to build a supporting arch from a piece of stiff cardboard. While the film depicts them gleefully ripping the cover off their flight plan, in reality they ended up using the cue cards intended for use on the lunar surface. They were also instructed to plug up the bypass hole of the cartridge with a sock or crumpled up piece of tape to allow airflow in a U-shaped path through the interior. They ultimately used a piece of towel. Perhaps the most challenging part of this entire procedure was actually getting the duct tape to stick to the cartridges, which were coated in slippery Teflon. The astronauts were thus forced to double the tape over itself in perpendicular belts over the exterior, with the sticky side out, allowing the plastic bag to be anchored in place. Later, Mission Control instructed the astronauts to tape 2 scrubber cartridges together, saving them from having to repeat the entire procedure with every cartridge. Once the scrubber adapters were completed, the astronauts connected them to the lunar module's ARS, keeping one set of outlet and inlet hoses inside the LEM and feeding another set through the docking tunnel to help rejuvenate the atmosphere in the command module. Throughout this procedure, Mission Control encouraged the exhausted astronauts to take their time with the adapter construction and get plenty of rest. However, the crew, concerned about the risk of falling asleep and never waking up again, decided to complete the work as quickly as possible. To everyone's delight, the ingenious MacGyvered solution worked, and 94.5 hours into the mission, CO2 levels were at 0.2 millimeters of mercury and falling. Mission Control estimated that with all the available canisters, that would give the Apollo 13 crew some 142 hours of CO2 scrubbing capacity, more than enough time to get them home. Even more capacity could be squeezed out of the cartridges from the PLSS backpacks, which, thanks to a far-sighted piece of design, could be plugged into auxiliary sockets in the lunar module ARS. Additionally, oxygen could be provided by the now unneeded PLSS backpacks, both from the regular tanks and those of the oxygen purge system. This consisted of a pair of high-pressure spherical tanks mounted atop the backpack, which in the event a spacesuit was breached, could flood the suit with enough oxygen to get the astronauts safely back to the LEM. But while the astronauts could now breathe easy knowing their spacecraft's atmosphere was secure, there were still dozens of other problems to be dealt with. Minimizing power consumption was still an ongoing concern, as was cooling water consumption, the two being intimately connected. The former was managed by powering down every piece of equipment not absolutely vital to the spacecraft's operation, including the radar heaters and the LEM's high-gain steerable antenna. Instead, the two omnidirectional S-band antennas mounted fore and aft of the cabin were used, with the astronauts switching between the two depending on which was receiving a clearer signal. Most displays, including the master alarm panel, were also powered down so that mission control would have to inform the astronauts of any major issues. All this was aimed at keeping overall electricity consumption below a baseline level of 14 amps. Water consumption, however, was a trickier issue. Fearing that at some point they would be forced to feed their drinking water into the LEM cooling system to keep its electronics running, the astronauts, unbeknownst to the flight surgeons back on Earth, were limiting themselves to a total daily water ration of 2.3 liters or 0.7 liters of water each, far below the healthy limit for an adult male. Various schemes were concocted for feeding cooling water from the PLSS backpacks or even stored urine into the LEM cooling system, allowing the astronauts to stretch their cooling capacity that much further. Jim Lovell also suggested that when it came to food, the astronauts should avoid the dehydrated meals. Not only did these require precious water to prepare, but without power available to heat this water, they would have been rather unpalatable. Instead, they would stick to ready-to-eat snack and wet pack meal items, which required no preparation. But while such rationing might seem prudent, it was making the astronauts extremely dehydrated. This would have severe consequences later on, as Fred Haise began exhibiting the symptoms of a urinary tract infection, including painful urination, fever, and chills. This condition would only become more unpleasant as the temperature in the unheated spacecraft continued to fall, causing condensation to form on every surface. Eventually, the temperature would reach a chilly 8 degrees Celsius or 46 Fahrenheit, prompting the astronauts to describe themselves as three men cold as frogs in a frozen pond. And Capcom Vance Brand jokingly ask, "Is it snowing in the command module yet?" It is worth noting here the specific technical reason the spacecraft became cold so quickly. While pop culture depicts space as being extremely cold, in reality, spacecraft designers have far more difficulty getting rid of excess heat than retaining it. This is because on Earth, there are three different ways of dispersing heat: conduction through another object, convection through the surrounding air, and radiation via infrared photons. In space, however, the first two methods are unavailable, forcing designers to dump heat into space using devices like infrared radiators and sublimators. The Apollo spacecraft was thus intentionally designed to both passively and actively radiate away as much heat as possible, contributing greatly to the growing misery of Jim Lau, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert. In a gesture that was likely genuine but poorly received by the astronauts, head of the astronaut office, Deke Slayton, suggested they warm up using the Exogenie, a set of handlebars connected to elastic bands used for exercising in microgravity. It's worth mentioning that in the film, the astronauts rip off their biosensor harnesses in an act of medical mutiny, with Jim Lovell declaring, "I am sick and tired of the entire Western world knowing how my kidneys are functioning." In reality, however, this was dramatized for the film, and once again, the astronauts here were pros. Thus, they obtained permission from the flight surgeons to remove their biosensors, not only because they were uncomfortable, but also because they consumed precious electrical power. As the mission entered its fifth day, the astronauts found themselves increasingly exhausted, the cold and damp conditions preventing them from getting any sleep. As Jim Lovell later recalled, the walls, ceiling, floor, wire harnesses, and panels were all covered with droplets of water. We suspected conditions were the same behind the panels. The chances of short circuits caused us apprehension, to say the least. But thanks to the safeguards built into the command module after the disastrous Apollo 1 fire in January 1967, no arcing took place. Thus, while the fire cost the lives of those Apollo 1 astronauts, it may well have saved the lives of the crew of Apollo 13. Whatever the case there, you might at this point be wondering why the astronauts didn't simply don their spacesuits to keep warm or something similar. It turns out that neither the astronauts' lightweight flight suits, known as constant wear garments or CGWs, nor their sleeping hammocks provided much protection against the cold. The crew did indeed briefly consider putting on their spacesuits for warmth, but discarded the idea for a good reason. As they later explained, first Jim Lovell would state, "Right now, it's still a little bit hazy in my mind whether we should have donned the suits. Without the suits, we were so much more maneuverable, especially in getting rid of urine and moving around, that I was reluctant to put on the suits." Fred Haise would expand, "The problem with suits is that your body can't breathe in them. With no hoses plugged in, there is no flow. Even as cold as it was inside the suit, one starts getting hot and sweaty. You've got to crawl out of them about every 2 hours. Then you're exposed, soaking wet, to that chilly atmosphere." In the end, the crew took to wearing the lunar boot covers as slippers, while Fred Haise found a more unusual means of finding warmth. "I would sleep in the tunnel next to the ECS unit. This was the warmest place. And I got in the sleep restraint and slept upside down in the tunnel with my face back towards the hatch. I zipped up my sleep restraint and used a string on it to hook myself to the hatch handle on the LEM hatch so I wouldn't drift away. It must have looked very strange." Later in the mission, when all was certain that there was plenty of electrical power available, the crew considered turning on the window heaters for warmth. However, they decided against it as the thermal shock might have cracked the glass. At around the same time, the prolonged cold led to an amusing incident in which the crew discovered that the sausages in their food rations were frozen solid, an incident accurately depicted in the film. While this period was relatively quiet compared to the previous 2 days, there were still plenty of problems to be dealt with, the most pressing being the steady drift of the spacecraft out of its re-entry corridor. As depicted in the film, for the spacecraft to return safely to Earth, it had to enter the atmosphere at a very precise angle, 6.52 degrees plus or minus 1 degree. Too steep, and it would decelerate too quickly and burn up. Too shallow, and it would skim off the atmosphere like a rock on a pond and bounce back into space. However, while the movie explains Apollo 13's drift off course as being due to the lack of heavy geological samples the crew was expected to be hauling back from the moon, and everybody at NASA not thinking of this is incorrect. It turns out all the people working at NASA were not stupid. In reality, the drift was caused by something more difficult for them to have accurately projected: gas venting from the damaged command module and the lunar module sublimator, which generated a small amount of lateral thrust. Mass was important, however, to the crew's eventual flight through the atmosphere. Unlike previous spacecraft, the Apollo command module was designed to give the crew a certain amount of control during re-entry. This was accomplished by offsetting the spacecraft's center of mass from its axis of rotation. During re-entry, the crew used the Reaction Control System, or RCS, to rotate the spacecraft about the axis, shifting its center of mass and causing the capsule to fly at a shallower or steeper angle. In this manner, they could adjust the craft's trajectory and land as close as possible to the recovery fleet. But the balance of the re-entering spacecraft was indeed predicated on the collection of moon rocks, so to compensate for the absence of these samples, Mission Control instructed the crew of Apollo 13 to stow a number of heavy items aboard the command module, including a tape recorder known as the Data Storage Equipment Assembly, DSEA, the thick lunar module flight data file, the astronauts' personal preference kits, or PKKs, used to store non-mission critical items, various still, movie and television cameras, oxygen hoses, lithium hydroxide scrubber canisters, geological sample containers, and the PLSS backpacks. To correct the spacecraft's drifting trajectory, the crew performed 2 more MCC burns using a sighting instrument called the Crew Optical Alignment Sight, or COAST, to line up the spacecraft with the Earth, aiming for the terminator or edge of the shadow on its surface. These burns were far less dramatic than what is depicted in the film, and as mentioned before, standard rather than hastily improvised. We'll say it again, the individuals working at NASA definitely had the right stuff. But while these burns successfully brought Apollo 13 back into its proper re-entry corridor, venting from the service module continued to cause the spacecraft's rotation to wobble. However, Mission Control decided this was acceptable, preferring to conserve precious maneuvering fuel than correct the wobble. For the time being, Apollo 13 was in good shape, at least as good as could be expected under the circumstances, with power consumption and oxygen, CO2, and water levels being well within the limits needed to get the astronauts home. But Murphy's Law, being what it is, another potential crisis was brewing, and it turns out, ironically considering the astronauts' frigid situation, heat in another area was becoming a problem. Pressure in the supercritical helium tank used to depressurize the DPS engine propellants was steadily rising as the tank absorbed heat from the sun. The tank was protected from overpressurizing and rupturing by a device called a burst disc, designed to fail and vent the tank when it reached a certain pressure. This event was predicted to occur at around 108 hours into the mission. While not ideal, Mission Control determines that even if the tank was vented, there would still be enough residual or blowdown pressure in the DPS to make any required course correction burns. In the film, the rupture of the burnt disc is shown catching the astronauts by surprise. In reality, this scene depicts another event which occurred 97 hours and 14 minutes into the mission, prompting Fred Hayes to report, "Okay, Vance, I just heard a little thump. It sounded like down in the descent stage, and I saw a new shower of snowflakes come up that looked like they were emitted from down that way." We've already decided though. I wonder what the supercrit pressure looked like now. This thump was soon traced not to the helium tank, but rather one of the 4 primary silver zinc batteries in the LEM descent stage. It was later determined that some of the potassium hydroxide electrolyte in the battery leaked out and shorted the terminals. This caused hydrogen and oxygen gas to form inside the battery and ignite explosively, rupturing the battery casing and sending snowflakes of electrolyte out into space. Mercifully, however, the battery eventually returned to normal function and gave no further trouble with the rest of the mission. As Apollo 13 drew ever closer to the Earth, Mission Control and the astronauts prepared to power up the command module Odyssey, which by now had lain dormant for nearly 3 days. To ensure the spacecraft had enough power to last all the way through re-entry and splashdown, the astronauts implemented an unusual procedure whereby the current through the umbilical connecting the 2 spacecraft, normally designed to allow the CSM fuel cells to power the LEM's onboard systems, would be reversed, allowing the command module batteries to be topped up using the remaining power in the LEM's batteries. The umbilical had never been designed for this, and the reverse power transfers would be highly inefficient, requiring 120 amp hours to transfer only 20 amp hours to the command module. But this was more than acceptable under the circumstances. Unlike what is depicted in the film, this procedure was not cooked up on the spot by Ken Mattingly, but, say it with me again, it had been worked out before by NASA engineers. However, this was the first time it had actually been tried out under flight conditions. On a related note, in the film, a character points out that 20 amps is barely enough to run a coffee pot for 9 hours, pointing to a nearby Mr. Coffee drip brewer. In reality, this style of coffee pot would not come onto the market until 2 years after the events of Apollo 13. In any event, as power was being transferred to the command module batteries, the crew set about powering up the spacecraft systems using a procedure carefully worked out by engineers and astronauts in simulators to minimize power consumption and conserve the CM's battery capacity. Yet despite entry interface being less than 30 hours away, Mission Control was slow in transmitting the required procedures, causing an exhausted Jim Lovell to lose his customary cool. Lovell, Vance, we've got to realize that we've got to establish a work-rest cycle up here, so we can't wait around here just to read procedures all the time up to the burn. We've got to get them up here, look at them, and then we've got to get the people to sleep. So take that into consideration when you get ready to send up the pads. Vance Brands, I know, Jim. We're very conscious of that. We should be ready to go in about 5 minutes. That's all I can say. Stand by. Lovell. Have we looked seriously now at just the essential things required to make a safe LEM jettison? We're not. I don't think we have the time to really do any engineering data that people might want to look at as this thing goes into the atmosphere. Brand. Well, Jim, I think that was what everybody aimed for, and people down here feel that it's the essentials. That is what you need. Lovell. Well, we'll do everything you think essential, but I just don't want to be throwing switches at the last minute. What we're really thinking about getting that command module in good shape. There's a pause. Tom Stafford. Hey Jim, this is Tom. The only reason we're bringing up the pings is to have another reference system to control the LEM when you jettison the thing. Over. Lovell. Okay, Tom. I thought an AGS at hold would have been sufficient for this when we first thought about this. Noteworthy, Tom Stafford, who had flown aboard Gemini 6, 9, and Apollo 10, would later fly aboard the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, and he was at this point the chief of the astronaut office and thus Jim Lovell's boss. Hence Lovell's sudden change of tone when Stafford came on the line. The crew's frustration, however, was understandable. Not only were they tired, cold, and in Fred Hayes' case, sick, but there were seemingly endless problems to work out before the rapidly approaching entry interface. For example, the astronauts worried that the docking hatch seal might have been damaged during the violent twisting and turning that followed the initial explosion. They thus wondered whether to re-enter wearing their spacesuits in case the cabin suddenly depressurized, something they had not done since Apollo 7. They also debated whether to carry the oxygen purge systems, or OPS, from the PLSS backpacks aboard the command module to supply additional oxygen. At 18 kilos each, these would have to be strapped down securely to prevent them flying around the cabin. In the end, however, the crew realized the spacesuits would make it too difficult to move around between the two docked spacecraft and decided to just risk it and re-enter without them. There was also the problem of undocking from the lunar module. Normally, this was done before the service module was jettisoned, with the service module thrusters being used to back the CSM away from the LEM to prevent the two spacecraft from colliding. However, for safety's sake, it was decided to jettison the service module first and keep the lunar module docked until the last minute. The undocking would thus be conducted with the docking tunnel partially pressurized, creating a small amount of thrust to push the lunar module out of the way. The time for command module jettison finally came at 138 hours and 3 minutes into the mission. The crew hit the CSM SEP switches, firing a series of explosive guillotines that severed the electrical and gas umbilicals connecting the command and service modules and pushing the two spacecraft apart. Immediately, the crew spun the command and lunar modules around and rushed to the windows with their cameras to record exactly what had happened to their spacecraft. What they saw shocked them, as this exchange reveals. Lovell. And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. Cohen. Is that right? Lovell. Right by the... Look out there, will you? Right by the high gain antenna. The whole panel's blown out, almost from the base to the engine. Cohen. Copy that. Hayes. Yes, it looks like it got to the SPS bell too, Houston. Cohen. Think it zinged the SPS engine bell, huh? Hayes. That's the way it looks, unless that's just a dark brown streak. It really is a mess. But while the astronauts took as many pictures as they could for later analysis, they could not dwell on the damage for too long, as there was still so much work to be done prior to re-entry. With all these preparations complete, at 140 hours into the mission, the crew opens the breakers between Odyssey and Aquarius, terminating the reverse power transfer and sealing the hatch connecting the two spacecraft. Then, at 141.5 hours, they finally jettisoned the LEM. Odyssey was on her own. As they watched the plucky little ship which had kept them alive drift away, both astronauts and flight controllers grew sentimental, crowing, "Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you." Lovell. She sure was a good ship. As Odyssey sped towards its rendezvous with the Earth, Capcom Jack Loosma relayed some good news. The weather at the landing site in the South Pacific was bright and clear. While a typhoon had been spotted in the area, it was some 800 kilometers away and later degraded to a tropical storm. Having been brought safely back from the moon through the ingenuity and dedication of thousands of men and women back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 13 entered the Earth's atmosphere on the afternoon of April the 17th, 1970, 142 hours and 40 minutes after liftoff. Soon, all communication was lost as Odyssey entered ionization blackout. In this, a sheath of ionized air surrounded the spacecraft, preventing any radio transmissions from getting in or out. Normally, this blackout lasted only 4 minutes, but as the seconds ticked by without any word from Odyssey, Mission Control began to fear the worst. Had the explosion damaged Odyssey's heat shield, they wondered, causing the spacecraft to burn up in the atmosphere? Or had some other unexpected catastrophe befallen the unlucky crew? In reality, Apollo 13 had simply entered the atmosphere at a slightly shallower angle than expected, extending the blackout by an agonizing 2 extra minutes. Finally, at 142 hours and 46 minutes into the mission, the radio crackled and command module pilot Jack Swigert came on the line. Swigert. Okay, Joe. Cohen. Okay, we read you, Jack. Long pause. Cohen. We're looking at the weather on TV, and it looks just as advertised. Real good. As depicted in the film, the men and women of Mission Control, who for 3 days have been biting their nails and working around the clock to bring the astronauts home, erupted in jubilant cheers as the television image showed Odyssey descending to Earth under 3 orange and white parachute canopies. At 6:07 in the afternoon, Greenwich Mean Time, 5 days, 22 hours, and 54 minutes after liftoff, they splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, its crew exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. Amazingly, this was the most precise landing in the history of the Apollo program, occurring just 5 kilometers from the recovery ship USS Iwo Jima. Minutes later, the US Navy helicopters arrived and Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert were winched aboard and flown to the recovery ship. In a fitting tribute, as the astronauts stepped out onto the deck, the ship's band played the tune Age of Aquarius. And another fun fact, the ship's captain, who greets the astronauts in the film, is none other than the real Jim Lovell, wearing his actual naval uniform, no less. Though Apollo 13 failed to land on the moon, it was nonetheless hailed as NASA's finest hour, showcasing just what the agency, and humanity as a whole, was capable of accomplishing when called to the task. As Jim Lovell later stated, "It's the teamwork of many people from different walks of life, from different companies to do a job. That's what we did. We're proud to come back today and tell you thank you." I think the mission matured the space program a little because people were perhaps getting a bit too complacent about what we do. Jack Swigert seconded this sentiment, stating, "We were able to come out of a completely unrehearsed, unplanned emergency in deep space. We thank you at KSC for doing an excellent job. I'll be just as eager and optimistic to leap off in any kind of machinery that you prepare for me." One intangible thing came out of this. It's not only brought all factions of our nation together, we even forgot racial problems and things like that, but it also, for a brief moment, united the world. I guess that is something that perhaps God in his wonders had intended to show that perhaps we can all live together at some point in time. As a token of appreciation, the astronauts presented the staff at Kennedy Space Center with an armrest they had recovered from Aquarius, the lifeboat which had sheltered them throughout their harrowing journey home. The engineers at Grumman Aircraft, who had designed the lunar module, were justifiably proud of their creation, which had been called to perform far more than what it had been designed to do, and it had come through with flying colors. In one of the most infamous jokes in spaceflight history, they even issued North American Rockwell, designers of the Command Service module, with a $400,000 invoice for, among other things, towing Odyssey 640,000 kilometers back to Earth, a battery charge using the customer's own booster cables, and providing sleeping quarters for 2 with an extra bed for a 3rd guest. But what actually happened to Apollo 13? What turned what was supposed to be a routine mission into one of manned spaceflight's greatest dramas that has inspired the world then to now? It turns out that the answer is a bit longer than discussed in the film, but still quite fascinating. A board of inquiry headed by astronaut Jim McDivitt eventually determined that the explosion aboard Apollo 13 had been caused by a relatively minor technical flaw 17 months before the spacecraft ever flew. On October 21st, 1968, the tank that would eventually become Apollo 13's number 2 oxygen tank was being removed from the Apollo 10 service module when a bolt snapped, causing the tank to drop about 5 centimeters. This incident, it is believed, caused minor damage to the fitting used to fill and drain the tank. At the time, however, nothing unusual was noted, and the tank was declared fit for use. Fast forward to March 17, 1970, when the final countdown demonstration test for Apollo 13 was conducted. At the conclusion of the test, technicians experienced difficulty draining the number 2 tank. They thus decided to energize the tank heaters in order to boil off the remaining oxygen. Normally, the thermostatic switches controlling the heaters should have shut them off automatically when the temperature exceeded 27 Celsius. However, at some point during the development of the launch hardware, the voltage of the launch pad systems had been increased from 28 volts to 65 volts. This change had been missed by the subcontractor who built the oxygen tank heaters, Beech Aircraft, meaning that when the heater was energized with 65 volts, the switches fused shut and continued to feed the heaters with power. Pad technicians were trained to notice if the heater gauges rose above 27 degrees, but this was the highest the gauges could read. As a result, the temperature inside the tank rose to over 500 Celsius, or around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, causing the Teflon insulation around the heater wires to become cracked and brittle. When Jack Swigert flipped the switch to stir the oxygen tanks, this cracked insulation allowed a spark to jump between the wires, igniting the flammable Teflon and starting an oxygen-fueled fire that caused the tank to explode with the equivalent force of 3 kilos of TNT. It was a tiny, easily overlooked flaw, but one that nearly resulted in Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert becoming the first astronauts to die in outer space. But for all the bad luck that plagued the fatefully numbered Apollo 13, one factor, above all others, contributed to the crew's ultimate survival: the fact that the explosion happened on the way to the moon. Had it happened after the landing, the crew would not have had access to their lunar module lifeboat and would most likely have perished. At the end of the 1995 film, Jim Lovell recounts what happened to all the major players in the Apollo 13 drama. Lovell himself retired from NASA shortly after Apollo 13 and from the US Navy in 1973. He later went on to work for various private companies, including the Bay Houston Towing Company, Fisk Telephone Systems, and the Centel Corporation. Fred Haise later served as backup commander for Apollo 16 and was slated to command Apollo 19, not 18, as stated in the film. However, due to budget cuts, the Apollo program was cancelled after Apollo 17 in 1972. Haise later carried out unpowered gliding tests for the Space Shuttle program before leaving NASA in 1979, serving as a test pilot for Grumman Aerospace Corporation until his retirement in 1996. He's also still alive. Due to his excellent performance during Apollo 13, Jack Swigert was originally selected as command module pilot for the 1975 Apollo-Soyuz test project, in which an American and Soviet crew would dock in orbit and perform experiments together as a symbol of detente. However, following Swigert's involvement in the Apollo 16 postal cover scandal, in which several astronauts colluded with a German philatelist to fly stamps into space in exchange for money, he was removed from the program and replaced with his Apollo 13 Capcom Vance brand. Swigert left NASA in 1977 and, as stated in the film, ran for US Congress, winning the seat for Colorado's 6th District in 1982. However, before he could take office, he was hospitalized for bone marrow cancer, dying on December 27, 1982, at the age of 52. And finally, Prime Command Module pilot Ken Mattingly, grounded due to his exposure to the German measles, never developed the disease and ultimately flew into space 3 times as Command Module pilot of Apollo 16 in 1972 and commander of the Space Shuttle missions STS-4 in 1982 and STS-51C in 1985. He retired from NASA in 1985 and worked for various companies, including Grumman, General Dynamics, and Lockheed Martin. He died on October 31st, 2023 at the age of 87. And that, dear viewers, is an extremely deep dive into the real-life story of Apollo 13. As you can see, the film gets the events of the actual mission mostly right, taking only a handful of largely understandable liberties for the sake of drama, and proving that sometimes Hollywood is capable of doing history justice. And showing, as ever, while the monetary cost of such endeavors into the great unknown and occasional extreme risk to those who venture out can be great, how these things have a way to unify humanity in a way few other things do and show off what we're capable of when we work together, perhaps in our increasingly polarized world, it's time we once again double down on reaching for the stars. Because we can. As noted by Lovell in the film, from now on, we live in a world where man has walked on the moon. It wasn't a miracle, we just decided to go. Thank you for watching.